Welcome to Mr. Sleep Story. Close your eyes, relax your mind, and let the rhythm of my voice carry you to a faraway lands. Today's story begins in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Nestled within a verdant valley surrounded by dense, ancient woods and mist-cloaked hills, the village of Eldermoor seemed to exist in its own pocket of time. The cobblestone streets were uneven and worn, whispering tales of centuries past under the boots of villagers and the wooden wheels of merchant carts. Small cottages lined the streets, their facades adorned with climbing ivy and vibrant blooms that spilled from window boxes. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, carrying the scents of baked bread and earthy hearth fires. Eldermoor was a place of simple pleasures and predictability, where life followed the steady rhythm of the seasons. Farmers rose with the sun to tend their fields. Artisans worked diligently in their shops, and children played along the banks of the crystal-clear brook that snaked its way through the village. Despite its idyllic charm, Eldermoor was also a place where dreams were small, and stories of adventure were confined to the pages of dusty books. Among the villagers was a young woman named Elara, whose restless spirit set her apart. While others found contentment in the steady cadence of village life, Elara often gazed beyond the hills with a longing she couldn't quite explain. She was of average height, but carried herself with a quiet confidence. Her hair, the color of sun-dappled chestnuts, often fell into disarray as though the wind itself enjoyed playing with it. Her green eyes, vivid and searching, seemed to hold the light of unspoken dreams and unanswered questions. Elara lived with her widowed father, a blacksmith whose hands were as strong as his heart was kind. Their modest home was situated near the edge of the village, close to the forest's boundary. The forest had always fascinated Elara, though the villagers warned against venturing too deep. They spoke of strange noises and fleeting shadows, of travelers who entered and were never seen again. Elara, however, couldn't suppress the pull she felt toward the towering trees and the mysteries they concealed. Her days were spent assisting her father in the forge, her arms gaining strength as she hammered glowing metal into tools and horseshoes. Though the work was honest, and her father's pride in her palpable, Elara often found her mind wandering. She imagined herself wielding a blade she'd forged with her own hands, slicing through dense jungle foliage as she unearthed forgotten relics. At night, under the blanket of stars, she would lie awake and let her thoughts drift to places far beyond Eldermoor. The village had its share of colorful characters who often crossed paths with Elara. There was old Marlowe, the storyteller, who spun tales of enchanted kingdoms and daring heroes in exchange for a warm meal. Though many dismissed his stories as fanciful nonsense, Elara hung on to every word. Then there was Greta, the apothecary, whose shop was filled with jars of dried herbs and potions that exuded a pungent but oddly comforting aroma. Greta had a knack for seeing into people's hearts, and she often told Elara, "You've got the soul of a wanderer, child. Don't let this village chain you." One fateful afternoon, as the sun dipped low and bathed Eldermoor in golden light, Elara decided to venture into the forest. She told herself it was to gather herbs for Greta, who had asked for a particular plant that only grew near the forest's edge. In truth, she simply wanted to feel the cool shade of the trees and hear the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Slinging a small satchel over her shoulder, she set out with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The forest was more beautiful than she had imagined. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled patterns on the mossy ground. The air was rich with the scent of pine and earth, and the distant sound of birdsong added a melodic undertone to the serene atmosphere. Elara wandered deeper than she intended, losing herself in the natural splendor. She was so absorbed in the moment that she nearly missed the faint, haunting melody drifting through the air. The sound was unlike anything she had ever heard. It was both eerie and beautiful, a tune that seemed to beckon her forward. Her heart raced as she followed the sound, weaving through trees and stepping over roots until she came upon a small clearing. At its center lay an object that shimmered faintly in the fading light. Cautiously, Elara approached and found a delicate, intricately carved locket resting on a bed of wildflowers. The locket was unlike anything crafted in Eldermoor. Its surface was engraved with swirling patterns that seemed to shift when touched by the light, and a faint warmth emanated from it as though it were alive. Elara's curiosity overwhelmed her caution, and she reached out to pick it up. The moment her fingers closed around the locket, the melody ceased, replaced by an intense stillness. The forest seemed to hold its breath as Elara examined her discovery. As she turned the locket over in her hands, she noticed a small, almost imperceptible clasp. When she opened it, a soft glow emanated from within, illuminating a tiny map etched on the interior. The map depicted a land Elara had never seen before, filled with symbols and landmarks that were both intriguing and unfamiliar. At the center of the map was an inscription written in a language she couldn't read, yet it seemed to speak directly to her heart. A sense of purpose surged within her, stronger than anything she had ever felt. The locket wasn't just an artifact. It was a key, a guide to something greater than herself. For the first time, Elara felt as though the dreams that had always seemed so distant were now within her grasp. She didn't know what awaited her beyond the hills, but she knew one thing for certain. Her life in Eldermoor was about to change forever. As the last rays of sunlight faded and the forest grew dim, Elara tucked the locket into her satchel and made her way back to the village. The journey home felt different, as though the world had shifted ever so slightly. The villagers carried on with their routines, oblivious to the profound discovery Elara had made. But in her heart, she knew that her ordinary world was only the beginning of an extraordinary adventure. The following morning, Elara woke with a sense of urgency she couldn't quite explain. The locket, now safely tucked away beneath her pillow, seemed to hum faintly against her touch, as though it was alive. Her mind was a whirlwind of questions. Where had it come from? What did the strange map inside mean? And why had she been the one to find it? Stepping outside, she was greeted by the familiar sight of Eldermoor. The village was already bustling with activity. The blacksmith's forge clanged with rhythmic precision. Merchants hollered about their wares, and the scent of freshly baked bread wafted through the air. But everything seemed different now, as if the locket had cast a shadow over the mundane and ordinary. Elara knew she couldn't share her discovery with just anyone. The villagers were kind and hard-working, but their curiosity rarely extended beyond their fields and hearths. Tales of magic and adventure were nothing more than entertainment to them, passed down from old Marlowe's fireside stories. But Elara needed answers, and there was one person she believed might help. Greta, the village apothecary, was unlike anyone else in Eldermoor. Her tiny shop was crammed with books, jars of herbs, and peculiar trinkets collected from distant lands. Some villagers whispered that Greta was a witch, though no one dared to say it to her face. Elara often spent her free time helping Greta gather herbs, or listening to her stories of the world beyond the village. If anyone could shed light on the locket, it was Greta. Carrying the locket in her satchel, Elara made her way to Greta's shop. The door creaked as she entered, and the familiar aroma of dried lavender and sage enveloped her. Greta was at her workbench, grinding a blend of herbs with practiced hands. She looked up and smiled warmly at Elara, her sharp blue eyes twinkling with curiosity. "Ah, my little wanderer," Greta said, her voice rich and melodic. "What brings you here so early? You usually save your visits for the afternoon." Elara hesitated, suddenly unsure of how to explain. "I found something in the forest yesterday," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. She reached into her satchel and pulled out the locket, placing it on the workbench. Greta's expression shifted the moment she saw it. Her smile faded, replaced by a look of intense focus. "Where did you find this?" Greta asked, her tone unusually serious. She picked up the locket with trembling hands, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings as if trying to decipher their meaning. "In the forest, near the clearing by the brook," Elara replied. "It was just lying there, glowing. I think it might be important." Greta's lips pressed into a thin line as she opened the locket and examined the map inside. The faint glow reflected in her eyes, and for a moment she seemed lost in thought. Then she let out a slow breath and looked up at Elara. "This isn't an ordinary trinket," Greta said. "It's ancient, older than this village, older than the stories we tell. These markings," she pointed to the swirling patterns. "They're protective runes, designed to shield something powerful. And this map, it leads to a place I've only heard of in legend." Elara leaned in, her heart pounding. What kind of place? Greta's gaze softened, and she placed a hand on Elara's shoulder. "A realm beyond our own, hidden from ordinary eyes. It's said to be a world of magic, but also of great danger. Few who seek it ever return." Elara's mind raced. The stories she had grown up hearing, the enchanted kingdoms, the brave heroes, suddenly felt real. She couldn't help but feel a spark of excitement, even as Greta's words hinted at peril. "Why would I find it?" Elara asked. "I'm just a blacksmith's daughter. Why me?" Greta smiled faintly. "Perhaps it's no coincidence. Sometimes objects of great power find their way to those who need them most. But make no mistake, child, this locket has chosen you. It's up to you to decide what to do with it." Elara hesitated. The idea of leaving Eldermoor, of stepping into the unknown, was both thrilling and terrifying. She thought of her father, toiling in the forge, and the quiet life they had built together. Could she really leave it all behind? As if sensing her doubt, Greta reached for a small, leather-bound book on her shelf and flipped through its pages. She stopped at an illustration of a locket identical to Elara's. Beneath it was a passage written in an ancient script, accompanied by a translation in Greta's neat handwriting. "This artifact," Greta read aloud, "is said to hold the key to the Gateway Realm, a place where magic thrives and secrets are guarded. Those who wield it must prove their worth through trials of courage, wisdom, and heart. Only then will the path be revealed." Elara stared at the passage, her resolve hardening. The yearning she had always felt, the longing for something more, was no longer a vague dream. It was a call, clear and undeniable. She couldn't ignore it. "What should I do?" she asked, her voice steady. Greta smiled knowingly. "You already know the answer." but if you're serious about this, you'll need help. The journey won't be easy, and there are forces in this world that would do anything to claim that locket. Elara nodded. Where do I start? Greta began gathering supplies, her movements quick and purposeful. She handed Elara a small pouch filled with herbs and a pendant inscribed with protective symbols. These will keep you safe, for a while at least. Follow the map. It will guide you to the first marker, but be vigilant. The locket's glow will fade as you near danger. Elara took the items, her determination growing. She had made her choice. The quiet life she had always known was behind her now, replaced by the promise of adventure. As she left Greta's shop, the locket seemed to pulse faintly against her chest, as though approving of her decision. Elara couldn't help but glance back at the village one last time. The familiar sights and sounds now felt like a distant memory, a part of her past that she was leaving behind. The path ahead was uncertain, but Elara's heart swelled with hope. For the first time in her life, she felt truly alive. Elara's journey began at the first light of dawn, the locket's faint glow her only guide. The map within was etched with strange symbols and unfamiliar landmarks, but its essence seemed to hum in her hands, subtly pulling her in a specific direction. She left Eldermoor with a satchel of supplies, the protective pendant Greta had given her, and a heart brimming with anticipation and fear. The forest was her first trial. Dense and ancient, it seemed to shift and breathe as she ventured deeper. The sun's light struggled to pierce the thick canopy above, casting the ground in dappled shades of green and gold. The air was cool and carried an earthy scent, punctuated by the occasional trill of a bird or the rustle of leaves stirred by unseen creatures. At first, Elara's steps were sure and determined, but as the day wore on, the forest grew darker and more oppressive. The trees became larger and older, their gnarled roots twisting like serpents across the path. A strange energy hung in the air, prickling her skin and making the hairs on her neck stand on end. She clutched the locket tightly, drawing courage from its steady warmth. When the path ended abruptly at a sheer rock face, Elara's confidence wavered. She glanced at the locket, hoping for guidance. To her amazement, the map inside began to shift, the glowing lines rearranging themselves to reveal a new route. The locket's magic was undeniable, and it reassured her that she was on the right path. She carefully scaled the rocky wall, her hands and feet finding purchase in the jagged surface. At the top, she found herself in a high clearing that overlooked a vast expanse of wilderness. The view was breathtaking. A sea of treetops stretching to the horizon, with glimmers of rivers and distant mountains bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. But what captured her attention most was the faint shimmer in the air at the clearing's center. It was like a veil of liquid light, rippling and translucent. The locket pulsed against her chest, urging her forward. Elara stepped closer, her heart pounding. As she reached out to touch the shimmering barrier, the air around her seemed to vibrate, and a soft, melodic hum filled her ears. The moment her fingers brushed the veil, the world tilted, and she was pulled through. Elara stumbled forward, disoriented by the sudden shift. When she regained her balance, she found herself standing in a world unlike anything she had ever seen. The sky above was a canvas of colors that constantly shifted and blended. Pinks, purples, and deep blues swirled together like an eternal sunset. Strange, floating islands drifted lazily in the air, their surfaces covered in glowing flora. Trees with crystalline leaves sparkled in the otherworldly light, and rivers of liquid silver wound their way through lush meadows dotted with luminescent flowers. The air was warm and carried a faint, sweet fragrance that seemed to invigorate her senses. Elara took a tentative step forward, her boots sinking slightly into the soft, moss-like ground. The sounds of this place were just as mesmerizing as its sights. Gentle whispers of wind, the distant chime of bells, and the occasional call of an unfamiliar creature. She turned in awe, taking in every detail. This was a world of magic, a realm beyond the wildest dreams of Eldermoor's storytellers. Her wonder was interrupted by a sudden rustling in the underbrush. Elara froze, her hand instinctively moving to the small dagger she carried at her hip. The bushes parted, and a small, winged figure emerged. It was no taller than her knee, with delicate, translucent wings that shimmered like a dragonfly's. Its face was humanoid but ethereal, with eyes that glowed softly like amber lanterns. "Well, well," the creature said in a lilting voice, crossing its tiny arms. "What's this? A human wandering into the gateway realm? Bold, if not entirely wise." Elara blinked, momentarily stunned. "You can talk?" The creature rolled its eyes. "Obviously. The real question is, what are you doing here? This isn't exactly a place for mortals." Elara hesitated, unsure how to explain. She decided to show the creature the locket, holding it out for it to see. The moment the locket caught the light, the creature's demeanor changed. Its eyes widened, and it hovered closer, inspecting the artifact with a mix of curiosity and reverence. "The locket of Althara," it murmured. "I thought it was lost ages ago." "You know what this is?" Elara asked eagerly. The creature nodded. "It's more than just a trinket. That locket is a key, a guide to the heart of this realm. If it's found you, then you must have a purpose here. My name is Liora, by the way." "And you are?" "Elara," she replied, relaxing slightly. "I don't really understand what's happening. I just followed the locket here." Liora tilted her head, studying Elara intently. "You're either very brave or very foolish. Perhaps both. But if the locket chose you, there's no turning back now. Come on, we need to move. This place is beautiful, but it's far from safe." Before Elara could respond, Liora darted off, her wings a blur. "Stay close," the fairy called over her shoulder. Elara followed Liora through the strange and wondrous landscape. As they traveled, Liora explained that the Gateway Realm was a place where magic flowed freely, but it was also a land of chaos and danger. Powerful beings known as the Eldritch had once ruled here, but their greed and ambition had fractured the realm, leaving behind pockets of corruption and shadow. They passed through a forest of glowing mushrooms taller than houses, their caps emitting a soft, bluish light. Strange creatures peeked out from behind the stalks, some curious, others clearly predatory. Liora warned Elara to avoid eye contact with the hunters, creatures with sleek, shadowy forms and piercing, golden eyes. Further on, they reached a meadow where the ground was covered in flowers that seemed to sing. Their petals moved gently, releasing melodic hums that formed a hauntingly beautiful harmony. Elara paused to marvel at them, but Liora pulled her along. "Don't linger too long," the fairy cautioned. "The beauty here often hides danger. These flowers can lull you into an eternal sleep if you're not careful." The locket guided them steadily, its glow intensifying as they moved closer to an unseen destination. Eventually, they reached the edge of a vast lake. The water was perfectly still, its surface reflecting the sky like a mirror. In the center of the lake was an island shrouded in mist, and at its heart, a towering spire of crystal rose into the sky. "That's the first marker," Liora said, pointing to the spire. "The Crystal Tower. It's where your journey truly begins." Elara felt a mix of awe and apprehension. The tower seemed to pulse with energy, its light resonating with the locket. She had no idea what awaited her inside, but she knew there was no turning back. "How do we get there?" she asked. Liora grinned mischievously. "That's the fun part. Hold on to your locket and don't let go." Before Elara could ask what she meant, Liora darted forward and touched the water's surface with a single finger. The lake rippled, and the ground beneath Elara's feet began to shift. A glowing path formed, spiraling toward the island like a bridge made of light. Elara stepped onto the path, her heart racing. The light beneath her feet was warm and solid, yet it felt as though she was walking on air. Liora flew alongside her, offering encouragement as they made their way across the lake. As they neared the island, the mist parted, revealing the base of the crystal tower. Its surface was smooth and reflective, etched with the same swirling patterns as the locket. The air around it hummed with energy, and Elara could feel its pull deep in her chest. "This is it," Liora said softly. "Your adventure has truly begun." Elara reached out to touch the tower, and as her fingers made contact, a surge of light enveloped her. She felt the world shift again, the familiar sensation of being pulled somewhere unknown. When the light faded, she stood in a grand hall filled with more wonders than she could have imagined. She was no longer a simple villager. She was a traveler in a world of magic, destined to uncover its secrets. The grand hall inside the crystal tower was a marvel beyond Elara's wildest imaginings. Its walls shimmered like liquid glass, reflecting a kaleidoscope of colors that shifted as if alive. Columns of glowing crystal stretched to a vaulted ceiling, where constellations danced in an eternal celestial display. At the center of the hall stood a pedestal, and atop it rested a small orb radiating a gentle blue light. Liora hovered beside Elara, her wings casting shimmering patterns on the floor. "This is the heart of the Gateway Realm," she whispered. "It's connected to the locket, and through it to you. But don't be fooled. This is just the beginning of your trials." Elara hesitated, feeling the weight of Liora's words. She approached the pedestal cautiously, the locket pulsing faintly against her chest as if in encouragement. As she reached for the orb, a deep, resonant voice filled the hall, echoing from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Seeker of the locket, you have entered the Gateway Realm. To claim its secrets, you must prove your worth. Courage, wisdom, and heart will be your guide. Beware, failure comes with a cost." Elara's hand froze, her pulse quickening. She looked at Liora, who nodded solemnly. "There's no turning back now," the fairy said. "Touch the orb and let the trials begin." Taking a deep breath, Elara placed her hand on the orb. A surge of energy coursed through her, and the world around her dissolved into light. Elara found herself standing in a dense forest, the trees gnarled and ancient, their bark covered in glowing runes. The air was thick with a strange, oppressive energy, and faint whispers surrounded her, weaving an unsettling melody. She couldn't make out the words, but their tone was urgent and ominous. "The Forest of Whispers." Liora's voice echoed faintly, though the fairy was nowhere to be seen. "This trial will test your courage. You must navigate the forest and reach the stone circle at its heart. But beware. This place preys on fear. Elara gripped the locket tightly and began walking, her eyes scanning the forest for any signs of danger. The whispers grew louder as she ventured deeper, the voices blending into a cacophony that seemed to echo her doubts and fears. "You're not strong enough," one voice hissed. "You'll fail like the others," sneered another. "What makes you think you're special?" a third mocked. Elara's steps faltered, her heart pounding. The whispers seemed to pull at her, their words striking at the insecurities she had carried for years. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to focus. "They're just voices," she muttered. "They can't hurt me." As if in response, the forest began to shift. Shadows coalesced into figures that loomed in the corners of her vision. They were indistinct at first, but as they grew closer, they took on familiar forms. Villagers from Eldermoor, their faces twisted in disdain. "Elara, the dreamer," one shadow taunted, "always chasing the impossible." "You'll bring ruin to us all," another said, its voice laced with venom. Elara stumbled backward, her courage wavering. The shadows closed in, their voices growing louder. But then the locket around her neck flared with warmth, and a memory surfaced. Her father's voice, steady and kind. "You have a strength in you, Elara," he had once said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Drawing on that memory, Elara stood tall. "You're not real," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her. "And you won't stop me." The shadows recoiled, their forms dissolving into mist. The whispers grew fainter, and the oppressive energy began to lift. With renewed determination, Elara pushed forward. After what felt like hours, she emerged into a clearing where a circle of ancient stones stood bathed in moonlight. The trial was over. She had faced her fears and prevailed. The forest dissolved, and Elara found herself standing at the entrance of a labyrinth. Its towering walls were made of smooth black stone, and an eerie silence hung in the air. The locket's glow dimmed, leaving her with only a faint light to guide her. "This trial will test your wisdom," the same resonant voice from the crystal tower said. "The path forward lies in understanding. Choose wisely." As Elara stepped into the labyrinth, the entrance sealed behind her. The air was cool, and her footsteps echoed unnaturally in the narrow corridors. At each turn, she encountered inscriptions etched into the walls, written in the same ancient script as the map in the locket. The first inscription read, "The heart speaks what the mind cannot." Puzzled, Elara continued, her fingers brushing the smooth stone. Soon, she reached a fork in the path. One corridor was brightly lit but narrow and treacherous, while the other was wide and dark, shrouded in uncertainty. Elara hesitated, recalling the inscription. She placed a hand on her chest, feeling the steady rhythm of her heartbeat. "The heart speaks what the mind cannot," she murmured. Closing her eyes, she let her instincts guide her and chose the dark path. The air grew colder as she ventured deeper, but the locket's warmth reassured her. At each fork, she encountered another inscription. To see the truth, one must look beyond appearances. The greatest wisdom is found in humility. Each choice required Elara to trust her intuition and reflect on the lessons she had learned. When she reached the labyrinth's center, she found a pedestal with a mirror resting atop it. The mirror's surface was clouded, and an inscription at its base read, "To see clearly, you must look within." Elara gazed into the mirror, her reflection faint and distorted. Taking a deep breath, she spoke aloud the doubts that had plagued her. The fear of failure, the feeling of inadequacy, and the longing for purpose. As she confessed her truths, the mirror cleared, and her reflection smiled back at her, whole and unbroken. The labyrinth dissolved, and Elara felt a deep sense of clarity and understanding. She had passed the second trial. Elara's surroundings shifted again, and she found herself standing on a narrow bridge suspended high above a chasm. The wind howled, and the bridge swayed precariously. Below, a swirling abyss of shadow seemed to reach for her, its tendrils writhing hungrily. "This trial will test your heart," the voice said. "To move forward, you must let go of what you hold most dear." Elara gripped the bridge's rope railings, her knuckles white. As she began to cross, the locket's glow dimmed, and the voice of the abyss began to rise, a mournful chorus of memories and regrets. Visions appeared in the swirling shadows below. Her father, toiling in the forge, her home in Eldermoor, the peaceful life she had left behind. Each vision tugged at her heart, filling her with longing. "You can turn back," a voice whispered. "Return to the life you knew. Leave this burden behind." Tears stung Elara's eyes as she paused in the middle of the bridge. The weight of the locket around her neck felt heavier than ever. She thought of her father, the quiet evenings by the hearth, and the safety of the village. It would be so easy to go back. But then she remembered Greta's words. "The locket has chosen you. It's up to you to decide what to do with it." Elara took a deep breath, her tears falling freely. "I can't go back," she said, her voice breaking. "I have to see this through." As she spoke, the visions below began to fade, replaced by a warm, golden light. The locket flared brightly, and the bridge steadied beneath her feet. She pressed forward, her steps resolute, until she reached the other side. The voice spoke one final time. "You have proven your worth, Seeker. Courage, wisdom, and heart have guided you. The path is now open." The trials had taken their toll on Elara, but she emerged stronger and more determined. On the other side of the bridge, she found a small, glowing stone embedded in the ground. As she touched it, the stone transformed into a radiant orb that floated above her hand. From the light of the orb, a figure emerged. A tall, armored warrior with piercing blue eyes and a sword of shimmering silver. He knelt before Elara, his expression one of respect. "I am Kael," he said, "guardian of the Gateway Realm. You have passed the trials and proven yourself worthy. I am here to serve as your guide and protector." Elara nodded, her exhaustion giving way to a spark of hope. With Kael and Liora by her side, she felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The locket's glow intensified, and a new path appeared before them, leading into the unknown. The path beyond the trials led Elara, Liora, and Kael to a barren, foreboding landscape unlike any they had encountered before. The air was heavy, laced with the acrid tang of sulfur, and the ground beneath their feet was cracked and blackened, as if scorched by a fire that had never cooled. The sky above was an oppressive shade of gray, veined with streaks of crimson lightning that illuminated the distant silhouette of a towering fortress. "There it is," Kael said grimly, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "The Shadow Spire. That's where Malgareth dwells." "Malgareth." The name alone sent a shiver through Elara's spine. She had heard fragments of his story from Liora during their journey, a sorcerer consumed by his lust for power, who had once ruled the Gateway realm with an iron fist. Banished long ago by the Eldritch, he had been thought defeated, but whispers of his return had grown stronger in recent years. It was now clear that the locket had drawn her here to stop him. "Is he as powerful as they say?" Elara asked, her voice steady despite the fear curling in her chest. Kael nodded, his expression somber. "He's more than powerful. He's cunning. He feeds on fear and doubt, using them to weaken his enemies. We must be vigilant." Liora flitted closer to Elara, her wings shimmering faintly in the dim light. "Don't let him into your head," she warned. "He'll twist your thoughts, make you question yourself. Stay strong, Elara. You've come this far for a reason." Elara tightened her grip on the locket, drawing strength from its warmth. "Let's finish this," she said, determination hardening her resolve. The journey to the Shadow Spire was treacherous. The landscape became more hostile with every step, the ground littered with jagged obsidian shards that seemed to bite at their feet. Rivers of molten lava crisscrossed the terrain, their glow casting an eerie red light that made the shadows seem alive. As they neared the fortress, the air grew colder, an unnatural chill that seeped into Elara's bones. The massive gates of the Shadow Spire loomed ahead, their surface carved with grotesque faces frozen in expressions of agony. The gates creaked open as they approached, as if the fortress itself welcomed them. Inside, the walls were lined with dark, pulsing veins that seemed to pulse faintly, as though the fortress were alive. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, and the faint sound of whispering voices echoed through the halls, their words unintelligible but unnerving. "This place feels wrong," Elara murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Kael nodded. "It's steeped in Malgareth's magic. Stay close and keep your guard up." As they ventured deeper into the fortress, they entered a vast chamber lit by an unnatural green glow. At its center was a raised dais, upon which stood a figure cloaked in shadow. Malgareth. He was taller than Elara had imagined, his form shrouded in a swirling black robe that seemed to absorb the light around him. His face was pale and angular, with eyes that burned like molten gold. In his hand, he held a staff crowned with a jagged crystal that pulsed with dark energy. "Ah," Malgareth said, his voice a silken drawl that echoed through the chamber. "The seeker of the locket. I've been expecting you." Elara felt an icy hand close around her heart as Malgareth's gaze settled on her. His presence was suffocating, as though the very air bent to his will. She gripped the locket tightly, drawing strength from its warmth. "You've come a long way," Malgareth continued, descending from the dais with an eerie grace. "And for what? To challenge me? To save a realm that has already fallen into ruin?" "The Gateway realm isn't yours to destroy," Kael said, stepping forward with his sword drawn. His voice was steady, but Elara could sense the tension in his stance. Malgareth chuckled, a low, sinister sound. Such bravado. "But tell me, Seeker, do you truly believe you can succeed where so many before you have failed?" Elara swallowed hard, refusing to let her fear show. "I didn't come here to fail," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. Malgareth's smile widened, revealing teeth as sharp as knives. "Brave words. Let's see if your actions match them." With a flick of his staff, the chamber erupted into chaos. shadows coalesced into monstrous forms, their glowing eyes and jagged claws filling the space. Kael charged forward, his sword flashing as he engaged the creatures, while Liora darted through the air, casting bolts of light that cut through the darkness. "Elara, the locket!" Liora shouted. "Use its power!" Elara hesitated, the chaos around her overwhelming. But as one of the shadow creatures lunged at her, she felt the locket pulse against her chest, a surge of energy flooding through her. She raised it instinctively, and a beam of golden light erupted from its surface, striking the creature and dissolving it into mist. The battle raged on, but with the locket's power and Kael and Liora's support, they managed to push through the shadowy horde. Malgareth watched from the dais, his expression unreadable. When the last of the creatures fell, he gave a slow, mocking clap. "Impressive," he said, "but the real test lies ahead." With another wave of his staff, the floor beneath them shifted, the stone cracking and falling away to reveal a spiraling staircase that descended into darkness. Malgareth vanished, his laughter echoing in the air. "He's leading us into a trap," Kael said, his sword still at the ready. "Of course he is," Liora replied. "But what choice do we have?" Elara nodded, steeling herself. "We keep going." They descended the staircase, the darkness growing thicker with every step. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and faint whispers brushed against Elara's ears, tugging at her resolve. She gripped the locket tightly, its steady warmth keeping her grounded. At the bottom of the staircase, they entered a cavernous chamber illuminated by the same crimson lightning that split the sky above. At its center was a massive, swirling vortex of dark energy, its tendrils reaching out like grasping hands. Malgareth stood before the vortex, his staff raised high. "This is the heart of the Gateway Realm's magic," he said, his voice echoing. "And soon, it will be mine to command." Elara stepped forward, the locket glowing brighter with each step. "You won't succeed," she said, her voice firm. Malgareth turned to her, his golden eyes narrowing. "And what will you do to stop me, Seeker? Your light is no match for my power." The vortex roared, its tendrils lashing out as Malgareth channeled its energy. Kael and Liora fought to hold them back, but Elara knew the battle would only end if she faced Malgareth directly. The locket pulsed, a wave of energy radiating from it and enveloping her in a protective aura. She stepped closer to Malgareth, her fear melting away as the locket's power filled her. "Your power comes from fear and darkness," Elara said. "But the locket's power is different. It's light, hope, and love." Malgareth sneered. "Foolish girl. Light cannot exist without shadow." "Maybe," Elara replied, "but shadows can't survive without light." Raising the locket high, she unleashed its full power. A blinding beam of golden light erupted from it, piercing the vortex and striking Malgareth. He screamed, the sound a mix of rage and pain as the light consumed him. The vortex began to collapse, its energy dissipating into the air. As the light faded, Malgareth was gone, and the chamber grew quiet. The oppressive darkness lifted, replaced by a soft, golden glow. Elara sank to her knees, exhaustion washing over her. Kael and Liora rushed to her side, their expressions a mix of relief and pride. "You did it," Liora said, her voice soft. "You stopped him." Elara looked at the locket, its glow now gentle and steady. "I didn't do it alone," she said, offering a faint smile. As they made their way back to the surface, the gateway realm began to transform. The barren landscape gave way to lush greenery, and the oppressive sky brightened to a serene blue. The realm was healing, its magic no longer corrupted. Elara knew her journey was far from over, but for the first time, she felt truly at peace. She had faced her fears, passed the trials, and defeated Malgareth. The gateway realm was safe, for now, and, in her heart, she knew this was only the beginning of her adventure. The shadow spire trembled beneath Elara's feet, the stone walls shuddering as the pulse of dark magic grew stronger. The locket around her neck flared with golden light, responding to the overwhelming surge of energy emanating from the fortress's heart. Malgareth's plan was nearly complete. If the vortex of dark energy at the center of the gateway realm reached its peak, it would shatter the balance of magic, plunging the world into eternal chaos. Elara, Kael, and Liora stood in the final chamber, their faces set with grim determination. The cavernous space was dominated by the vortex, a swirling mass of black and crimson energy that roared like a living storm. Tendrils of dark power lashed out at the walls, cracking the stone and sending shards raining down. At the edge of the vortex stood Malgareth, his form shadowy and distorted, his golden eyes burning with triumph. His staff glowed with the same dark energy as the vortex, a symbol of his command over the chaos he had unleashed. "You're too late," Malgareth called out, his voice reverberating through the chamber. "The gateway realm will fall, and with it, all who oppose me. You cannot stop what has already begun." Elara stepped forward, her hand tightening around the locket. The warmth it radiated gave her strength, pushing back the fear threatening to take hold. "You're wrong, Malgareth," she said, her voice steady. "This realm isn't yours to destroy. Its magic belongs to everyone, not just you." Malgareth laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Bold words, little seeker. But words won't save you now. Let's see if you have the strength to match your conviction." With a sweep of his staff, Malgareth unleashed a wave of dark energy that surged toward them like a tidal wave. Kael stepped forward, his sword glowing with a silvery light as he raised it to meet the attack. The energy collided with his blade, sending a shockwave through the chamber that forced Elara and Liora to shield their faces. Kael gritted his teeth, his boots skidding on the stone floor as he struggled to hold back the force of the attack. "Elara," he shouted, "you have to stop the vortex. We'll hold him off." Elara nodded, her heart pounding as she turned to Liora. The fairy hovered beside her wings shimmering despite the oppressive darkness. "We need to get to the base of the vortex," Elara said. "The locket. It's the key. If I can use its power, I might be able to stabilize the magic." Liora hesitated, glancing at Kael as he fought to repel Malgareth's onslaught. "It's dangerous," she said. "The closer you get to the vortex, the more it will try to consume you. Are you sure you can handle it?" Elara met her gaze, determination burning in her green eyes. "I don't have a choice. This is what I came here to do." Liora nodded, her expression softening. "Then, let's make it count." Together, they moved toward the vortex, weaving through the chaos as tendrils of dark energy lashed out around them. Each step was a battle. Elara could feel the pull of the vortex, an overwhelming force that seemed to claw at her very soul. The locket grew hotter against her chest, its golden light pushing back the darkness with every pulse. Meanwhile, Kael faced Malgareth head-on, his sword clashing with the sorcerer's staff in a flurry of sparks and magic. Malgareth's movements were fluid and calculated, his strikes laced with the raw power of the vortex. But Kael fought with unwavering resolve, his blade glowing brighter with each swing. "You think you can stop me, Guardian?" Malgareth sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're nothing but a relic of a broken order." Kael smirked, deflecting a strike with ease. "Maybe, but a relic still has its uses." He drove forward, forcing Malgareth to retreat toward the edge of the vortex. The sorcerer snarled, raising his staff to summon another wave of dark energy. But Kael was ready, his sword cutting through the magic like a blade through water. "You can't protect her forever," Malgareth hissed. "The Seeker will fall, and so will you." Elara and Liora reached the base of the vortex, the sheer force of its energy threatening to knock them off their feet. The air was thick with the scent of ozone, and the roar of the swirling magic was deafening. Elara could feel the locket's pull growing stronger, its light now almost blinding. "What do we do now?" Liora shouted over the noise. Elara held up the locket, its golden glow flickering like a heartbeat. "I think it needs to connect with the vortex," she said, "but I don't know how." Leora's eyes darted to the symbols etched into the stone floor around the vortex. "Those runes, they're part of the Gateway Realm's magic. They might be the key to channeling the locket's power." Elara nodded, stepping carefully into the circle of runes. As she did, the locket's glow intensified, and the runes began to shimmer with golden light. She could feel the magic flowing through her, a surge of energy that was both exhilarating and terrifying. "Focus, Elara," Liora called out. "You can do this." Malgareth's attention shifted as he sensed the shift in the vortex. His golden eyes narrowed, and he turned to see Elara standing within the circle of runes, the locket blazing with light. "No!" he roared, abandoning his fight with Kael to face her. He raised his staff, unleashing a torrent of dark energy aimed directly at Elara. But Kael was faster. He threw himself in front of the blast, his sword absorbing the brunt of the attack. The force knocked him backward, but he managed to stay on his feet. "You're not getting to her," Kael growled, his voice filled with defiance. Malgareth snarled, raising his staff for another strike, but Liora darted forward, her small form glowing with radiant light. She flitted around the sorcerer, her bolts of energy striking him in rapid succession. Though they didn't harm him, they served as a distraction, buying Elara precious time. Elara closed her eyes, focusing on the locket's warmth and the magic flowing through her. She could feel the essence of the Gateway Realm, the balance of light and dark, the pulse of life that connected everything. The locket wasn't just a key, it was a conduit, a bridge between the two forces. Taking a deep breath, she raised the locket high above her head. Its light surged, intertwining with the vortex's dark energy in a dazzling display of gold and crimson. The ground trembled as the two forces clashed, their power filling the chamber with an overwhelming radiance. Malgareth screamed, his form flickering as the light from the locket consumed him. "This isn't over, Seeker," he roared. "The darkness will return." With a final, desperate strike, he aimed his staff at Elara, but the locket's power erupted in a blinding wave of light, shattering the staff and engulfing Malgareth completely. His scream echoed through the chamber as his form dissolved into nothingness. As the light faded, the vortex began to shrink, its tendrils retreating until it was no more than a faint shimmer. the oppressive darkness that had filled the shadow spire lifted, replaced by a serene, golden glow. The ground beneath their feet steadied, and the cracks in the walls began to mend. Elara sank to her knees, the locket still glowing faintly in her hand. She felt drained but triumphant, the weight of the journey finally lifting from her shoulders. Kael and Liora rushed to her side, their faces etched with relief. "You did it," Kael said, his voice filled with pride. "The Gateway Realm is safe." Liora landed on Elara's shoulder, her small hand resting gently on her cheek. "You were incredible," she said. "I've never seen magic like that before." Elara smiled weakly, her exhaustion evident. "I didn't do it alone," she said. "I had both of you." As they made their way out of the Shadow Spire, the Gateway Realm began to transform. The barren landscape was replaced by lush greenery. The rivers of lava cooled into crystal-clear streams, and the sky turned a brilliant shade of blue. The balance of magic had been restored, and the realm was alive once more. Back at the Crystal Tower, Elara placed the locket on the pedestal where her journey had begun. Its glow dimmed, as if it were finally at rest. The voice of the tower resonated once more, warm and grateful. "Seeker, you have restored balance to the Gateway Realm. Your courage, wisdom, and heart have saved us all. The locket will remain here, its power safeguarded for future generations." Elara stepped back, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and sorrow. She had completed her mission, but she knew her journey wasn't over. There were still mysteries to uncover, adventures to pursue, and a world beyond the Gateway Realm waiting for her. With Kael and Liora by her side, Elara left the Crystal Tower, the promise of new beginnings shining brightly in her heart. The journey back to Eldermoor was as surreal as it was bittersweet. The Gateway Realm, once shadowed by Malgareth's darkness, now shimmered with vibrant life. The forests glowed with radiant hues, the rivers sparkled like silver threads, and the air carried a melody that seemed to echo the balance that had been restored. Yet, as beautiful as it was, Elara knew her time in this magical realm had come to an end, at least for now. Kael walked beside her, his silver armor gleaming under the ethereal sky. Liora flitted ahead, her laughter ringing out as she darted among the rejuvenated flowers. They made their way to the portal that had first brought Elara to this realm, the locket's light serving as their guide. Though the portal shimmered invitingly, its edges now soft and welcoming, Elara hesitated at its threshold. "You've accomplished more than anyone could have asked of you," Kael said, sensing her unease. His deep voice carried a rare gentleness. "But you don't have to leave. You could stay here. The Gateway Realm would welcome you as its protector." Liora landed lightly on Elara's shoulder, her tiny face alight with hope. "Kael's right. You belong here, Elara. You've proven yourself over and over. This world could use someone like you." Elara looked at her companions, their loyalty and belief in her filling her heart. She considered their words, the allure of staying in this magical place tugging at her. But as much as she had grown to love the Gateway Realm, her thoughts turned to her father. The quiet life she had left behind, and the simple yet profound connections of home. Eldermoor might not have the grandeur of floating islands or glowing forests, but it was still where her journey had begun. "I can't stay," she said finally, her voice soft but firm. "As much as I love this place, my home is in Eldermoor. There are people waiting for me there, people who need me." Leora's wings drooped, but she managed a small smile. "I'll miss you," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. Kael nodded, his expression unreadable. "Then this isn't goodbye," he said. "The Gateway Realm will always be here, and so will we. If you ever need us, or if we need you, the locket will find a way." Elara's chest tightened at his words. She stepped forward and hugged Liora gently, the tiny fairy pressing a hand to her cheek in return. Then she turned to Kael and offered her hand. He took it firmly, his grip warm and steady. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Without another word, Elara stepped through the portal, the golden light enveloping her in a warm embrace. When the light faded, Elara found herself standing at the edge of the forest near Eldermoor, the familiar scent of pine and earth greeting her like an old friend. The locket, which had been her constant companion, was no longer glowing. Its surface was cool and still, as if it too had returned to rest. The village looked exactly as she had left it, yet everything felt different. The cobblestone streets, the colorful cottages, and the bustling market seemed smaller now, almost quaint. Elara walked through the village square, her boots clicking softly against the stones. Villagers greeted her with smiles, unaware of the incredible journey she had undertaken. To them, she was still the same Elara, the blacksmith's daughter. But she knew she had changed. As she approached her home, the familiar clang of metal on metal reached her ears. Her father was at the forge, his powerful arms swinging the hammer with precision. The sight filled her with a wave of nostalgia and warmth. She stepped closer, her heart pounding with anticipation. Her father looked up, his face breaking into a wide grin when he saw her. "Elara," he called out, setting down his hammer and wiping his hands on his apron. "You're back." She ran to him, throwing her arms around his broad shoulders. He hugged her tightly, his embrace grounding her in a way nothing else could. "I was starting to worry," he said, his voice tinged with relief. "Where have you been?" Elara hesitated, unsure how to explain. How could she put into words the magic, the trials, and the battles she had faced? She settled on a half-truth. "I needed to see what was beyond the forest," she said, "to find something I didn't even know I was looking for." Her father pulled back, studying her with a mixture of curiosity and pride. "And did you find it?" Elara smiled, her hand brushing the now quiet locket beneath her tunic. "Yes," she said simply, "I found it." Life in Eldermoor resumed its familiar rhythm, but Elara's perspective had shifted. The forge, once a place of routine, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where she could shape not just metal, but also her future. She worked alongside her father, honing her craft with a newfound appreciation for the ordinary. Yet, Elara couldn't forget the Gateway Realm or the lessons it had taught her. She found herself sharing bits of her journey with the villagers, weaving them into the fabric of old Marlowe's stories. The children listened with wide eyes as she spoke of glowing forests and heroic battles, while the adults nodded along, thinking it was nothing more than Elara's vivid imagination. Greta, however, wasn't so easily fooled. When Elara visited the apothecary to deliver herbs or simply chat, Greta would give her knowing looks, her sharp blue eyes seeming to see straight into her soul. "You've changed, child," Greta said one afternoon, her tone gentle. "The world outside these hills has touched you. Don't lose that spark. It's rare and precious." Elara nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I won't," she promised. Though the locket no longer glowed, Elara kept it close, wearing it beneath her tunic as a reminder of all she had endured. Sometimes, in the quiet moments of the night, she thought she could feel it pulse faintly, as if whispering to her of far-off places and untold adventures. One evening, as she sat by the fire, her father spoke up. "You seem different," he said, his tone thoughtful. "Like you've seen things most people can't even imagine." Elara looked at him, her heart aching with the weight of all she wanted to say. "I have," she admitted, "and it's made me realize how much there is out there, beyond what we know. But no matter how far I go, this will always be my home." Her father smiled, pride shining in his eyes. "That's all I could ever hope for." Though Elara had returned to Eldermoor, she knew her story wasn't over. The Gateway Realm had left its mark on her, and she felt its pull even in the quiet moments of village life. She could sense that the locket's magic was not entirely dormant, waiting for the right moment to call her again. Elara paused for a moment longer in the clearing, letting the faint melody wash over her. It was softer now, almost a whisper, but it carried the same promise of mystery and wonder. The wind rustled through the trees, brushing her cheek like a familiar caress. For the first time, she truly understood that the world was vast and brimming with endless possibilities, and she was part of it in a way she had never imagined before. The locket rested against her chest, its weight a comforting reminder of all she had overcome. She reached up to touch it, her fingers brushing the intricate carvings that had once felt foreign and enigmatic. Now, they felt like an extension of herself, a symbol of her strength, her growth, and the connections she had forged along the way. As she turned back toward the village, Elara felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her journey had taught her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the resolve to move forward in spite of it. Wisdom wasn't knowing all the answers, but being willing to learn and adapt. And true strength came not from magic or weapons, but from the bonds she had built and the belief in herself. When she reached Eldermoor, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The villagers greeted her warmly as she passed, their lives continuing in the same steady rhythm as before. Yet, in their smiles, Elara saw something she hadn't noticed before: hope. Perhaps it had always been there, but now she could see it clearly, a reflection of the light she had found within herself. That night, as she sat by the fire in her home, her father fast asleep in his chair, Elara gazed out the window at the star-filled sky. She knew the world was still full of challenges, and the Gateway Realm might call her back someday. But she also knew she was ready for whatever came next. "I'll never forget," she whispered to the night, her voice soft but resolute. "The journey, the magic, the lessons, they're part of me now, and they always will be." And with that, Elara leaned back, her heart light and her spirit unbreakable. Though her feet were firmly planted in Eldermoor, her soul was forever a wanderer, ready to embrace whatever adventures awaited her just beyond the horizon. In the silence, the locket pulsed faintly once more, as if to say, "This is only the beginning." The night was quiet on the cobblestone streets of London, where the Darling family resided in a modest yet cozy home on Bloomsbury Street. The nursery, a charming room tucked under the eaves of the house, was where 3 young siblings spent their nights dreaming of adventure. Wendy, the eldest, was a girl on the cusp of young adulthood, her head full of fantastical tales she often wove for her brothers, John and Michael. The two boys, a pair of bright-eyed and boundlessly curious children, adored Wendy's stories of pirates, fairies, and the mysterious boy who could fly. Little did they know that these tales were more than mere flights of imagination. They were echoes of a world that would soon change their lives forever. Mr. and Mrs. Darling were loving but practical parents. Mr. Darling, a meticulous man with a strong sense of propriety, was determined to climb the social ladder and provide the best for his family. His wife, gentle and nurturing, often served as the anchor that balanced her husband's ambitions. Together, they created a household filled with structure and warmth. Yet, as grounded as their lives seemed, an air of magic always lingered in the nursery, thanks to Wendy's vivid imagination. Wendy's stories often centered around Peter Pan, a boy who lived in a magical place called Neverland. According to Wendy, Peter Pan was a mischievous, fearless boy who never grew up and spent his days battling the fearsome Captain Hook, befriending fairies, and leading the lost boys. These tales captured the essence of childhood wonder, a realm where anything was possible, and adventure awaited at every turn. John and Michael would hang on every word, their eyes wide with excitement as Wendy brought her characters to life. But Peter Pan was more than just a figment of Wendy's imagination. Unknown to Mr. and Mrs. Darling, Peter often visited the nursery. He would sit on the windowsill, listening to Wendy's stories and marveling at her ability to recount the events of his own life with such accuracy. Accompanied by his tiny, feisty companion, Tinker Bell, Peter's visits went unnoticed by everyone except the family dog, Nana, who often barked at the window late into the night. The Darling parents dismissed this as the dog's overactive instincts, unaware of the magic unfolding right under their noses. Nana, a loyal and clever Newfoundland, served not only as a pet, but also as the children's nursemaid. She had a peculiar way of organizing the nursery, placing the boys' wooden swords and shields neatly in one corner and ensuring that Wendy's books were stacked just so. Despite her diligence, Nana could not shake the feeling that something unusual was afoot. She would often sit by the window, her eyes scanning the night sky as though expecting something extraordinary to appear. One particular evening, as the children prepared for bed, the air in the nursery felt different. Wendy had just finished telling a particularly thrilling tale of Peter Pan's latest duel with Captain Hook, and the boys were still buzzing with excitement. Mr. Darling, frustrated with the chaos, sternly reminded them that such nonsense would only distract them from becoming respectable adults. Mrs. Darling, however, couldn't help but smile as she tucked the children in, her heart warmed by their innocence and joy. As the lights dimmed and the children drifted off to sleep, Mrs. Darling lingered in the nursery, gazing at their peaceful faces. She thought she saw a flicker of movement near the window, but dismissed it as her imagination. If only she had looked closer, she might have seen a small, mischievous figure silhouetted against the moonlight, poised to bring the extraordinary into their ordinary lives. The stage was set. The Darling children, with their hearts full of wonder and a yearning for adventure, were about to embark on a journey that would forever blur the lines between reality and fantasy. Little did they know that their dreams of Peter Pan and Neverland were about to leap from the realm of stories into the dazzling, impossible reality beyond their nursery window. It was a particularly still night when Peter Pan decided to make his next visit to the Darling nursery. The moon hung high, casting a silvery glow over the city, and a gentle breeze swayed the curtains at the nursery window. Inside, the room was quiet, save for the rhythmic breathing of the sleeping children. Nana lay curled up by the door, her ears twitching occasionally, as though sensing something out of the ordinary. Suddenly, the faintest chime of tiny bells echoed through the room, a sound so delicate it might have been mistaken for the wind. But it was no ordinary sound. It was the arrival of Tinker Bell, her light flickering like a restless firefly as she zipped into the nursery. She darted around the room, her wings humming softly, inspecting every corner before signaling to the window. Moments later, Peter Pan appeared, slipping through the window with the ease of someone who belonged there. His tousled hair gleamed in the moonlight, and a mischievous grin played on his lips. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never known fear or doubt. Peter's first priority was finding his shadow. During his last visit, it had somehow gotten away from him, and he had been unable to coax it back. He knew it must be hiding somewhere in the nursery, and with Tinker Bell's help, he began his search. Tinker Bell, however, was not in the mood for shadow hunting. She buzzed around Peter, chattering in her tiny, bell-like language, clearly annoyed by the inconvenience. Her light cast fleeting shadows on the walls as she flitted about, and Peter shushed her impatiently, worried she might wake the children. Eventually, Peter's eyes fell on a drawer in the corner of the room, slightly ajar. A triumphant smile spread across his face as he crept over and pulled it open. There it was, his wayward shadow, crumpled and sulking among Wendy's neatly folded nightgowns. With great care, Peter tried to reattach it to himself, but the shadow proved uncooperative. It wriggled and squirmed like a living thing, slipping out of his grasp each time he thought he had secured it. Frustrated, Peter sat down on the floor, clutching the shadow as though it might make a run for it. The commotion stirred Wendy from her sleep. At first, she thought she was dreaming. The sight of a boy sitting on her nursery floor wrestling with what appeared to be his own shadow was so absurd it could only belong in one of her stories. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she realized this was no dream. She gasped softly, sitting up in bed. "Who are you?" she whispered. Peter looked up, startled but not alarmed. His grin returned and he puffed out his chest proudly. "I'm Peter Pan," he said, as though the name alone explained everything. Wendy's eyes widened. "Peter Pan? From Neverland?" "The very same," Peter replied, clearly pleased that his reputation had preceded him. "And who are you?" "I'm Wendy Darling," she said, still trying to process what was happening. "What are you doing here?" Peter held up the shadow, which was now behaving itself for the moment. "I came to get this," he explained. "It got away from me last time I was here." Wendy blinked, her curiosity overcoming her surprise. "Would you like some help?" Peter hesitated for a moment before nodding. Wendy climbed out of bed and retrieved her sewing kit from a small box on the dresser. As she knelt beside Peter, she couldn't help but marvel at how real he was. He wasn't just a figment of her imagination. He was flesh and blood, with a presence that seemed to fill the room. With careful hands, Wendy began to sew Peter's shadow back onto his feet. The work was delicate, and she found herself holding her breath as she stitched. Peter watched her with wide-eyed fascination, clearly unused to anyone doing something for him. Tinker Bell, meanwhile, perched on the edge of the dresser, her tiny arms crossed and an expression of barely concealed jealousy on her glowing face. When the last stitch was tied off, Peter leapt to his feet, his shadow moving in perfect harmony with him. He laughed, a bright, joyous sound that seemed to fill the room with light. "It's perfect," he declared, spinning around to admire Wendy's handiwork. "Thank you, Wendy." Before she could respond, John and Michael stirred in their beds, awakened by the commotion. Their eyes snapped open, and they stared in disbelief at the strange boy standing in their nursery. "Who are you?" John demanded, his voice a mix of sleepiness and suspicion. "I'm Peter Pan," Peter said again, striking a dramatic pose. "And I've come to take you all to Neverland." The moon hung low over London as the darling children clung tightly to Peter Pan, their hands grasping his and Tinker Bell's trail of golden pixie dust lighting up the night sky. Their adventure to Neverland had begun. The streets below grew smaller and smaller as they rose higher, the city transforming into a patchwork of glimmering lights and winding roads. It was a breathtaking sight, but for Wendy, John, and Michael, it was only the beginning of a world far beyond their wildest dreams. Peter, flying effortlessly, looked back at the children with a grin. "Keep your thoughts happy," he called, his voice carrying over the rush of wind. "That's how you stay afloat." Wendy, her heart racing with excitement and trepidation, focused on the stories she had told so many times. Pirates, mermaids, and adventures filled her mind, lifting her higher as her feet dangled in the open air. John, ever the curious one, tried to calculate how fast they were traveling, though the thrill of flying made his calculations waver. Michael, clutching his teddy bear tightly, giggled uncontrollably, his little legs kicking as if to propel himself faster. Tinker Bell darted around them like a tiny comet, her light flickering as she added bursts of pixie dust to ensure their flight remained steady. Though her glow was enchanting, her demeanor was less so. She chattered in her bell-like language, her tone making it clear she found the darling children an unnecessary addition to the journey. Peter paid her no mind, his focus on leading the group toward the second star to the right. As they soared higher, the noise of the city faded into silence, replaced by the sound of the wind and the occasional exclamation of awe from the children. Stars surrounded them, so close it felt as though they could reach out and touch them. Wendy's eyes widened as she noticed constellations she had only read about in books. Here, among the stars, they seemed alive, sparkling with a life of their own. "Peter, how much further?" Wendy called, her voice carrying a mix of anticipation and nervousness. Peter twisted mid-air, flying backward effortlessly as he grinned at her. "Not far now. Just keep looking at the star, the second one to the right. That's our guide." The journey continued, and soon the air grew warmer, a hint of salt carried on the breeze. The stars seemed to part, revealing a horizon unlike anything the children had ever seen. In the distance, a lush island emerged, surrounded by a sparkling turquoise sea. Mountains rose majestically at its center, and waterfalls cascaded down into dense emerald forests. The sandy beaches glowed under the moonlight, and the gentle sound of waves reached their ears as they drew closer. "Welcome to Neverland," Peter declared, spreading his arms wide as if presenting a grand treasure. The children gasped in unison. Neverland was everything Wendy had ever imagined and more. It was a place where dreams and reality intertwined seamlessly, where the impossible felt as natural as breathing. As they descended toward the island, the details became clearer. They could see the tops of the trees swaying gently, the glint of something shiny, perhaps treasure, scattered on the beaches, and the faint flicker of campfires in the distance. Peter led them to a clearing just outside the dense forest, where the lost boys had set up their hideout. The hideout was a series of interconnected tree houses, each one uniquely crafted from the natural materials of the island. Rope bridges stretched between the trees, and lanterns made from hollowed-out gourds glowed softly, casting warm light over the bustling scene below. The lost boys, alerted by Peter's arrival, emerged from their various hiding spots with whoops and cheers. They were a ragtag group of boys of various ages, dressed in mismatched clothing that hinted at their adventurous lives. Some wore pirate hats too big for their heads, others sported animal pelts, and a few had faces streaked with dirt and war paint. They surrounded Peter with an energy that was both chaotic and joyful. "You brought guests," one of the boys exclaimed, his eyes wide as he took in Wendy, John, and Michael. "These are the darlings," Peter announced proudly. "Wendy, John, and Michael. They'll be staying with us for a while." Wendy stepped forward, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "Hello," she said, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "It's wonderful to meet all of you." The boys stared at her for a moment before erupting into cheers and questions. "Are you going to tell us stories? Do you know how to sword fight? Can you cook?" Peter raised his hands to calm the crowd. "Wendy's here to take care of us, like a mother. She'll tell us stories and keep everything in order." Wendy blinked, slightly taken aback by the title of mother, but decided not to protest. If it meant being part of this extraordinary world, she would play along. "I'll do my best," she promised. John and Michael, meanwhile, were quickly pulled into the boys' games. John found himself engaged in a mock sword fight with a boy named Slightly, who wielded a wooden saber with surprising skill. Michael, clutching his teddy bear, was shown the treehouse where he would sleep, complete with a hammock and a pile of soft blankets. As the excitement settled, Peter took Wendy aside, his expression serious for the first time since they had arrived. "There's something you should know about Neverland," he said. "It's not just fun and games. There are dangers here, too." Wendy frowned, her curiosity piqued. "What kind of dangers?" "Pirates," Peter replied, his eyes narrowing. "Led by Captain Hook. He's always looking for a way to get to me and the Lost Boys. And there's more. Mermaids, fairies, and even the island itself can be tricky. But don't worry. As long as you stick with me, you'll be safe." Wendy nodded, her resolve firm. "We'll be careful." Peter's grin returned. "Good. Now come on. Let me show you the rest of the island." The rest of the night was a whirlwind of exploration. Peter led the darlings through the forest, showing them the hidden lagoon where mermaids gathered under the moonlight, their laughter echoing off the water. He pointed out the pirate ship anchored off the coast, its dark silhouette a reminder of the ever-present threat of Hook. They visited a grove of trees that glowed with bioluminescent light, the air around them humming with a strange, magical energy. By the time they returned to the hideout, the children were exhausted but exhilarated. Wendy tucked Michael into his hammock and watched as John fell asleep mid-sentence, his wooden sword still clutched in his hand. She sat by the fire with Peter, who gazed out at the stars with a faraway look in his eyes. "What are you thinking about?" Wendy asked softly. Peter shrugged. "Just about tomorrow. There's always something new in Neverland. That's what makes it so great." Wendy smiled, her heart full of wonder. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing for certain. Life would never be the same again. The dense jungle of Neverland buzzed with life as Peter Pan and the darling children landed softly in a small clearing surrounded by towering trees. The moon cast dappled shadows through the leaves, creating an otherworldly glow. Wendy, John, and Michael looked around in awe, their senses overwhelmed by the vibrant sights, sounds, and smells of this magical island. Every inch of Neverland seemed alive, from the chirping of strange, colorful birds to the faint rustle of leaves that hinted at unseen creatures watching them. "We're here," Peter announced with a flourish, gesturing to the sprawling hideout nestled among the trees. It was a masterpiece of ingenuity and whimsy, a series of interconnected tree houses suspended high above the ground. Each structure was built from wood, leaves, and other natural materials, blending seamlessly with the forest. Rope bridges swayed gently between the trees, illuminated by lanterns carved from hollowed-out gourds, their light casting a warm, inviting glow. Tinker Bell darted ahead, her glow lighting the way as she tinkled impatiently. Her small, bell-like voice was unintelligible to the children, but her tone made her annoyance clear. She disappeared into one of the tree houses, leaving a trail of pixie dust behind her. "Welcome to the Lost Boys' hideout," Peter declared proudly. "This is where we live, play, and plan our adventures." As if on cue, the Lost Boys emerged from their various nooks and crannies, their whoops and cheers echoing through the trees. They were a wild, ragtag group of boys, each with their own unique look. One wore a hat made from a fox's head, its tail draped over his shoulder. Another sported a vest patched together from colorful scraps of fabric. A third boy, slightly older and taller than the rest, wielded a wooden sword that he twirled skillfully in his hand. "Peter's back," one of them shouted, prompting a wave of excited chatter as they gathered around their leader. "And he brought guests." Peter held up his hands to quiet the crowd. "These are the darlings," he announced. "Wendy, John, and Michael. They're going to stay with us for a while." The boys turned their attention to the newcomers, their eyes wide with curiosity. Wendy stepped forward, her hands clasped nervously. "Hello," she said with a warm smile. "It's lovely to meet you all." The Lost Boys stared at her in silence for a moment before erupting into a cacophony of questions. "Can you tell us stories? Are you going to be our new mother? Do you know how to fight pirates?" Peter raised his hands again, his grin widening. "Wendy's here to tell us stories and take care of us, just like a mother would. She'll make sure we're fed, happy, and ready for all our adventures." Wendy blinked in surprise but quickly recovered. If playing the role of a mother meant being part of this magical world, she was more than willing to embrace it. "I'll do my best," she promised. John and Michael were quickly swept up in the excitement. John found himself drawn into a game of mock sword fighting, sparring with Slightly, the boy with the wooden sword. Despite his initial hesitation, John's natural competitiveness soon took over, and he began to enjoy the playful battle. Michael, clutching his teddy bear tightly, was shown to a small, cozy corner of the hideout where he would sleep. One of the Lost Boys handed him a blanket made from soft animal fur, which Michael accepted with wide-eyed gratitude. As the initial excitement died down, Peter led Wendy to a quiet spot near the edge of the hideout. From here, she could see the sprawling landscape of Neverland stretching out before her. Mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks shrouded in mist. A sparkling lagoon glittered under the moonlight, its surface disturbed only by the occasional ripple of a swimming mermaid. The dense jungle seemed to pulse with life. its shadows hinting at mysteries yet to be discovered. "It's beautiful," Wendy said softly, her voice filled with wonder. Peter nodded, his expression uncharacteristically serious. "Neverland is full of magic and adventure," he said, "but it's also dangerous. You'll need to be careful." Wendy turned to him, her curiosity piqued. "What kind of dangers?" Peter's eyes narrowed. "Pirates," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Captain Hook and his crew are always looking for a fight. And there are other things, too. The mermaids can be tricky, and even the fairies aren't always friendly." Wendy nodded solemnly. "We'll be careful," she promised. Peter's grin returned. "Good. Now come on, there's more to see." The rest of the night was a whirlwind of exploration. Peter took the darlings on a tour of the hideout, introducing them to the Lost Boys' various projects and games. They climbed rope ladders, swung from vines, and even tried their hand at crafting their own wooden swords. Wendy quickly found herself surrounded by boys eager to hear her stories, their eyes lighting up as she began to weave tales of daring heroes and fantastical adventures. John and Michael, meanwhile, threw themselves into the games with gusto. John's logical mind led him to suggest improvements to the hideout's defenses, an idea that was met with enthusiastic approval. Michael, despite his young age, proved surprisingly adept at keeping up with the older boys, his teddy bear never leaving his side. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the children finally settled down. Wendy tucked Michael into his hammock and smoothed his hair as he yawned sleepily. John, exhausted but exhilarated, fell asleep almost immediately, his wooden sword resting beside him. Wendy sat by the fire, watching the flames dance as Peter joined her. He gazed at the stars, a faraway look in his eyes. "Do you ever get lonely?" Wendy asked softly. Peter shrugged. "I have the Lost Boys, and Tink, and now you. I don't need anything else." Wendy's heart ached at his words, but she didn't press further. Instead, she let the moment settle into a comfortable silence, the warmth of the fire and the magic of Neverland filling the air. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew one thing for certain. Life in Neverland would be an adventure unlike any other. The Jolly Roger loomed menacingly over the bay, its dark sails billowing in the breeze and its hull reflecting the moonlight like the blade of a dagger. Anchored just offshore, the pirate ship was a fortress of wood and iron, its decks crawling with activity as Captain Hook's crew prepared for another night of scheming. The faint scent of brine and gunpowder mingled in the air, a constant reminder of the danger that shadowed Neverland. Captain James Hook stood at the helm, his figure silhouetted against the horizon. His long coat, deep crimson and trimmed with gold, swayed dramatically in the wind. A wide-brimmed hat with an ostrich feather perched atop his head, casting a shadow over his angular face. His piercing blue eyes scanned the dark waters, ever watchful for signs of his nemesis, Peter Pan. His iron hook, a replacement for the hand Peter had severed in battle, glinted under the moonlight as he absently tapped it against the ship's railing. Hook was a man consumed by vengeance. Every fiber of his being burned with the desire to capture Peter Pan, the boy who had humiliated him and fed his severed hand to the crocodile. The thought of that cursed reptile made Hook's lip curl in a snarl. Somewhere out there, the creature lurked, its relentless ticking a harbinger of his eventual doom. The sound haunted his dreams, a constant reminder of time slipping away. Smee! Hook's voice boomed, cutting through the cacophony of the crew's chatter and the creak of the ship's timbers. Mr. Smee, Hook's loyal and bumbling boatswain, hurried to his side, nearly tripping over a coil of rope in his haste. "Aye, Cap'n," he said, his round face beaming with a mixture of eagerness and nervousness. "What news of the lost boys?" Hook demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Smee fidgeted, wringing his hands. "Well, nothing concrete, sir, but we've got word they're still hiding out in the jungle. That Pan boy's been keeping 'em safe, as usual." Hook's expression darkened. "Blast that infernal boy," he muttered. "And what of the newcomers? The children he brought with him?" "Oh, aye," Smee said, his face lighting up. "The darling children, they're called. A fine addition to his little band, I hear. They've been settling in nicely." Hook's eyes narrowed. "The darling children," he repeated, his mind already calculating. "Perhaps they are the key. If we can capture them, Peter Pan will come to us." Smee nodded enthusiastically. "A brilliant plan, Captain. Absolutely brilliant." Hook's lips curled into a cold smile. "Ready the men," he ordered. "We strike at dawn." In the dense jungle of Neverland, the lost boys slept soundly in their hideout, unaware of the danger creeping closer. The jungle itself seemed to hum with an uneasy energy, as though it sensed the pirates' approach. Hook's crew moved silently through the underbrush, their boots muffled by the thick carpet of leaves. Each man carried a weapon: cutlasses, flintlock pistols, and daggers glinting faintly in the moonlight. They moved with practiced precision, their eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of their quarry. Hook, leading the charge, paused as the hideout came into view. He could see the faint glow of lanterns among the trees, hear the soft murmur of voices. He raised a hand, signaling his men to halt. "Wait for my command," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "We'll take them by surprise." But the pirates' stealth was no match for Tinker Bell's sharp eyes. The fairy, flitting through the trees on her nightly patrol, spotted the intruders and immediately darted back to the hideout. Her tiny voice rang out like an alarm bell as she woke Peter Pan and the lost boys. "Pirates!" she cried, her light flickering with urgency. Peter was on his feet in an instant, his eyes blazing with excitement. "Wake up, everyone," he shouted. "It's time for a fight." The lost boys scrambled to their positions, grabbing weapons and donning makeshift armor. Wendy, John, and Michael were roused from their hammocks, their sleepy confusion quickly replaced by determination. Wendy helped the younger boys prepare, her calm presence a steadying force amid the chaos. John, eager to prove himself, grabbed a wooden sword and joined the others at the front line. Michael clung to his teddy bear, but stood bravely by Wendy's side. The first clash came swiftly. Hook's men stormed the hideout, their battle cries echoing through the jungle. The lost boys met them head-on, their smaller size compensated by their agility and resourcefulness. Peter, laughing with wild abandon, led the charge, his dagger flashing as he darted between pirates, outmaneuvering them at every turn. Wendy watched in awe as Peter faced off against Hook, their duel a blur of steel and fury. Hook's movements were calculated and precise, while Peter's were fluid and unpredictable. They were evenly matched, their rivalry fueling every strike and parry. "You'll pay for this, Pan," Hook snarled, his hook clashing against Peter's dagger. Peter grinned. "You've been saying that for years, Hook. Still waiting." Meanwhile, John and Michael found themselves in the thick of the battle. John's logical mind helped him anticipate the pirates' moves, while Michael's sheer enthusiasm kept him on his feet. Together, they held their own, earning the respect of the Lost Boys. The tide of battle began to turn as the pirates realized they were outmatched. Hook, his face twisted with frustration, called for a retreat. The pirates fled back into the jungle, leaving behind their weapons and supplies. The Lost Boys erupted into cheers, their victory hard-won and well celebrated. Peter turned to his friends, his grin as bright as the morning sun. "We did it!" he shouted. "The hideout is safe!" Wendy smiled, her heart swelling with pride and relief. She knew the danger wasn't over, but for now, they could breathe easy. Neverland, with all its perils and wonders, was still their home. Neverland was a world where adventure lurked around every corner, a land of unending possibilities and countless dangers. For Wendy, John, Michael, and the Lost Boys, every day brought new challenges, thrilling escapades, and moments of discovery. Peter Pan, ever the fearless leader, guided them with an infectious enthusiasm that made even the most perilous situations seem like games. Their first grand adventure began not long after the pirates' retreat. Peter, eager to show the darlings all that Neverland had to offer, gathered the group at the base of the hideout's largest tree. "Today, we're going to explore the Mermaid Lagoon," he announced, his eyes sparkling with excitement. "But be careful. The mermaids aren't always as friendly as they look." The lagoon was a dazzling expanse of crystal-clear water surrounded by jagged rocks and lush vegetation. The surface shimmered under the sunlight, and the air was filled with the soft sound of cascading waterfalls. As the group approached, the mermaids emerged from the water, their iridescent tails glinting in a rainbow of colors. They sang hauntingly beautiful songs that seemed to echo through the entire lagoon. Wendy was enchanted by the sight, but Peter's warning lingered in her mind. The mermaids' beauty was undeniable, but their sharp, knowing smiles hinted at a more mischievous nature. When one of them beckoned Wendy closer, Peter intervened, placing himself between her and the water. "Careful," he said. "They love to pull people into the water for fun, but they don't always let them back out." The mermaids giggled, their laughter like the tinkling of bells. One of them splashed water at Peter, who laughed and splashed back, turning the moment into a playful game. The others joined in, and soon the lagoon was filled with splashes and laughter. Wendy watched from the shore, her initial caution giving way to amusement. John, ever curious, leaned over the edge of the water, trying to examine the mermaids more closely. "They're fascinating," he murmured, adjusting his glasses. One of the mermaids swam up to him and playfully tugged at his sleeve, causing him to stumble backward and fall into the shallow water. The group erupted in laughter, and even John couldn't help but chuckle as he climbed back onto the rocks, dripping wet. Michael, meanwhile, found a small, sparkling shell on the shore. He held it up to show the others, his face alight with wonder. "Look what I found," he exclaimed. A mermaid swam over, eyeing the shell with interest. She reached out to take it, but Michael quickly pulled it back. "It's mine," he said firmly, clutching the shell to his chest. Peter grinned. "You're learning fast, Michael. Never give up treasure without a fight." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the lagoon, the group decided to head back to the hideout. The mermaids waved them off, their songs fading into the distance as the children disappeared into the jungle. The lagoon adventure had been a success, but Peter assured them that it was only the beginning. The next day brought a different kind of challenge. Peter had spotted smoke rising from the jungle and was convinced it was coming from the camp of the indigenous tribe that lived in Neverland. The lost boys, eager for a new adventure, followed Peter as he led the way through the dense underbrush. The camp was a vibrant collection of colorful tents and totems, surrounded by a ring of ceremonial fires. The tribe's leader, a wise and imposing figure named Chief Great Bear, greeted Peter with a nod of recognition. The two shared a mutual respect, though their relationship was often marked by playful rivalry. "Peter Pan," the chief said, his deep voice resonating through the camp. "What brings you here today?" Peter grinned. "We saw your smoke and thought you might be planning something exciting. Can we join?" The chief's stern expression softened into a smile. "You are always welcome, Peter. But remember, our games are not for the faint of heart." The tribe invited the group to participate in a series of challenges designed to test their bravery and skill. The first was a hunting game, where they had to track a trail of clues through the jungle. Wendy, John, and Michael teamed up with the Lost Boys, their competitive spirits driving them to work together. Wendy proved to be an excellent tracker, her keen eyes spotting details others missed. John used his logical mind to decipher the clues, and Michael's boundless energy kept the group moving forward. The final challenge was a test of courage, crossing a narrow bridge made of vines that stretched over a deep ravine. The tribe watched from the sidelines, cheering and offering encouragement. Wendy hesitated at the edge, her heart pounding as she looked down at the dizzying drop. Peter appeared beside her, his confidence unwavering. "You can do it, Wendy," he said. "Just don't look down." With Peter's encouragement, Wendy took a deep breath and stepped onto the bridge. The vines swayed under her weight, but she focused on the other side, placing one foot in front of the other. When she finally reached the end, the tribe erupted into cheers, and Wendy felt a surge of pride. She had faced her fear and conquered it. The day ended with a grand feast, the tribe sharing their food and stories with the children. Wendy found herself drawn to the chief's daughter, a spirited girl named Lila, who spoke of her own adventures in the jungle. The two quickly became friends, and Wendy marveled at Lila's courage and resourcefulness. Not every adventure in Neverland was light-hearted. One afternoon, while exploring a cave near the coast, the group stumbled upon a hidden treasure trove. The cave was filled with gold coins, jewels, and artifacts, their beauty almost blinding in the dim light. But the treasure was not unguarded. As they ventured deeper into the cave, they encountered a massive sea serpent, its scales shimmering like polished metal. The serpent's eyes glowed with an otherworldly light as it let out a low, menacing hiss. The children froze, their excitement turning to fear. Peter, however, remained undaunted. He drew his dagger and stepped forward, his posture fearless. "Stay back," he warned the others. "This one's mine." The battle that followed was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. Peter moved with incredible speed and agility, dodging the serpent's strikes and countering with precise attacks. The cave echoed with the clash of scales and steel, the air thick with tension. Wendy watched in horror and admiration, her heart pounding as she silently prayed for Peter's safety. Finally, with a well-aimed strike, Peter delivered a fatal blow. The serpent let out a final, shuddering hiss before collapsing to the ground. The group erupted into cheers, their fear replaced by exhilaration. Peter, though victorious, waved off their praise. "It was nothing," he said with a grin, wiping his dagger clean. "Just another day in Neverland." Each day in Neverland brought new adventures, each one more thrilling than the last. Whether they were outsmarting pirates, exploring uncharted territories, or making new friends, the children found themselves growing braver, stronger, and more connected to this magical world. For Wendy, John, and Michael, Neverland was more than just a place. It was a journey of self-discovery, a world where they could be heroes in their own right. And yet, amid all the excitement, a sense of foreboding lingered. Wendy couldn't shake the feeling that their time in Neverland was fleeting, that the adventures they cherished might one day come to an end. But for now, she pushed those thoughts aside, determined to savor every moment in this land of endless wonder. Night had fallen over Neverland, and the jungle was alive with the sounds of chirping insects and rustling leaves. The lost boys and the darling children had gathered around a fire at the heart of their hideout, the warm glow casting dancing shadows on the trees. Wendy had just finished telling one of her stories, and the boys were settling down for the night when a sudden rustling in the bushes sent everyone on edge. Peter Pan was the first to react, his dagger drawn and his eyes scanning the darkness. Tinker Bell flitted nervously around his shoulder, her light dimming as she whispered a warning in her bell-like language. Before anyone could ask what was wrong, a net flew through the air, ensnaring two of the lost boys. Chaos erupted as pirates burst from the jungle, their swords gleaming in the firelight. The attack was swift and brutal. The pirates had been planning this ambush for weeks, and their strategy was flawless. While some captured the lost boys and the darling children, others set fire to parts of the hideout, forcing the group to scatter. Wendy, John, and Michael were dragged kicking and screaming toward the waiting pirate ship, their shouts of protest drowned out by the triumphant cries of the pirates. Peter fought valiantly, his dagger flashing as he tried to fend off the attackers. He managed to free a few of the lost boys, but was soon overwhelmed by the sheer number of enemies. As the pirates retreated into the jungle with their captives, Peter's cries of frustration echoed into the night. The Jolly Roger was an ominous sight as it loomed over the bay, its black sails billowing in the night breeze. The prisoners were herded onto the deck, where Captain Hook awaited them. Hook's eyes gleamed with malice as he surveyed his captives, his hook tapping rhythmically against the railing. "Well, well," Hook drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. "What a delightful catch we have tonight. Peter Pan's precious little friends." Wendy stepped forward, her chin held high despite the fear that gripped her heart. "You won't get away with this," she said boldly. "Peter will come for us." Hook's smile widened. "Oh, I'm counting on it," he replied. "But when he does, it will be the last mistake he ever makes." The captives were forced into the ship's brig, a dark and damp space that reeked of salt and decay. Wendy huddled with her brothers, whispering words of comfort to keep their spirits up. John tried to devise an escape plan, while Michael clutched his teddy bear, his wide eyes filled with fear. Above deck, Hook gathered his crew, outlining his plan to finally defeat Peter Pan. The pirates cheered at the prospect of their captain's long-awaited revenge, their voices echoing across the bay. Hook, however, remained wary. He knew Peter would come, but he also knew the boy's cunning. This time, Hook vowed he would be ready. Back at the hideout, Peter Pan paced restlessly. The fire had been extinguished, and the remaining lost boys sat in a solemn circle, their usual energy replaced by fear and uncertainty. Tinker Bell hovered nearby, her light flickering as she tried to calm Peter. "We have to rescue them," Peter said, his voice low but determined. "I won't let Hook win." "But how?" Slightly asked, his voice trembling. "The Jolly Roger is guarded, and Hook is waiting for you." Peter's eyes blazed. "Then we'll give him what he wants, but we'll do it on our terms." With Tinker Bell's help, Peter devised a daring plan. The Lost Boys would create a diversion, drawing the pirates away from the ship while Peter and Tinker Bell infiltrated the brig to free the captives. It was risky, but Peter's confidence was infectious, and the Lost Boys rallied behind their leader. The plan unfolded under the cover of darkness. The Lost Boys set small fires in the jungle and used slingshots to launch rocks at the pirates, creating chaos and confusion. Hook, enraged by the disturbance, ordered most of his crew to investigate, leaving the Jolly Roger lightly guarded. Peter and Tinker Bell slipped aboard the ship unnoticed, their movements silent and precise. Tinker Bell's light guided them through the labyrinthine corridors until they reached the brig. Peter picked the lock with a hairpin he had swiped from Wendy earlier, grinning as the door swung open. "Peter," Wendy whispered, her voice filled with relief. She and the others rushed forward, their faces alight with hope. "Quiet," Peter cautioned. "We're not out of this yet." As they made their way back to the deck, the group encountered a small group of pirates who had remained behind. A fierce battle ensued, with Peter leading the charge. Wendy, armed with a stolen dagger, fought bravely alongside her brothers and the Lost Boys. Even Michael, clutching his teddy bear in one hand, managed to trip a pirate with a well-placed kick. The commotion drew Hook back to the ship, his fury reaching new heights as he realized his prisoners were escaping. He confronted Peter on the deck, their rivalry reigniting in a flurry of clashing steel. Hook fought with ruthless precision, but Peter's agility and quick thinking gave him the upper hand. "Give up, Hook," Peter taunted, dodging a swipe of the captain's hook. "You'll never win." Hook's response was a growl of frustration as he lunged at Peter, his movements becoming increasingly erratic. The battle raged across the deck, with the other children and Lost Boys cheering Peter on. Finally, Peter disarmed Hook, sending his sword clattering to the ground. "This isn't over, Pan," Hook snarled, retreating toward the edge of the ship. Before Peter could respond, the ominous ticking of the crocodile reached their ears. Hook's face paled as the creature emerged from the water, its jaws snapping eagerly. With a cry of terror, Hook leapt overboard, disappearing into the sea. The crocodile followed, its ticking fading into the distance. The pirates, leaderless and demoralized, surrendered, allowing the children to take control of the ship. As dawn broke over Neverland, the Jolly Roger sailed into a quiet cove, now under the control of Peter and his friends. The rescued children and Lost Boys celebrated their victory, their laughter echoing across the water. Wendy, John, and Michael sat together on the deck, their faces alight with joy and relief. "We did it," Wendy said, her voice filled with pride. "We really did it." Peter grinned, his usual swagger returning. "Of course we did. No one beats Peter Pan." As the sun rose higher, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the group set their sights on the horizon. There would be more adventures to come, more battles to fight, and more memories to make. For now, though, they savored their hard-won freedom, their bond stronger than ever in the magical land of Neverland. The days following their daring rescue passed in a blur of celebration and camaraderie. Yet, as the thrill of victory began to fade, the darling children found themselves thinking more often of home. Neverland had given them adventures beyond their wildest dreams, but the memory of their parents and the quiet comfort of their nursery began to pull at their hearts. One evening, as the stars shimmered brightly over the island, Wendy approached Peter Pan. He was perched on a branch of the tallest tree in the hideout, gazing out at the horizon. Tinker Bell hovered nearby, her glow soft and steady. Wendy hesitated for a moment before climbing up to join him. "Peter," she began gently, "we need to talk." Peter turned to her, his expression curious. "What is it, Wendy?" She took a deep breath. "It's time for us to go home. John, Michael, and I, we belong in London with our family." Peter's face fell, the light in his eyes dimming. "You want to leave?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "It's not that we don't love it here," Wendy explained quickly. "Neverland is wonderful, and we'll never forget the adventures we've had. But our parents must be so worried about us. And we can't stay children forever." Peter frowned, his gaze drifting back to the horizon. "I can't grow up," he said quietly. "That's why I stay here. Growing up means losing everything that makes life fun." Wendy placed a hand on his shoulder. "Growing up doesn't mean losing everything, Peter. It means gaining new adventures, new experiences. And you'll always have Neverland. You'll always have the Lost Boys." Peter didn't respond right away. He stared at the stars, his thoughts unreadable. Finally, he nodded. "If you want to go, I'll take you back. But promise me one thing, Wendy." "Anything," she said earnestly. "Promise you won't forget me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Wendy's heart ached. "I could never forget you, Peter Pan." The next morning, Peter announced the darling's decision to the Lost Boys. The boys protested, their voices a chorus of dismay. "You can't leave," Nibs cried. "Who will tell us stories?" "You'll have each other," Wendy assured them. "And you'll have Peter. He'll take care of you, just like always." The Lost Boys reluctantly accepted her words, though their sorrow was evident. They spent the day preparing for the journey, gathering supplies and saying their goodbyes. Even Tinker Bell, who had never been fond of Wendy, seemed subdued. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Peter led the darlings to the edge of the island. The children clutched their belongings tightly, their hearts heavy with a mix of excitement and sadness. "Ready?" Peter asked, his tone brighter than his expression. Wendy nodded, her brothers at her side. "We're ready." With a wave of his hand, Peter sprinkled pixie dust over them. "Think happy thoughts," he reminded them. "That's how you fly." The darlings closed their eyes, recalling memories of home. Their mother's gentle smile, their father's laughter, the warmth of their nursery. Slowly, they rose into the air, Peter and Tinker Bell leading the way. The journey back to London was both magical and bittersweet. The stars seemed brighter than ever, and the night air was cool and refreshing. The children marveled at the sight of the city as it came into view, the familiar streets and rooftops bringing a sense of comfort and belonging. Peter guided them to the window of their nursery, which was slightly ajar as if waiting for their return. He hovered just outside as Wendy, John, and Michael climbed inside. The room was exactly as they had left it, the toys neatly arranged and the beds made. A soft light from a lamp on the bedside table cast a warm glow over the room. Mrs. Darling was asleep in a chair by the window, her face peaceful but lined with worry. Wendy approached her quietly, her heart swelling with love. "Mother," she whispered, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. Mrs. Darling stirred, her eyes fluttering open. When she saw Wendy and her brothers, her expression shifted from confusion to overwhelming joy. "My children," she cried, pulling them into a tight embrace. Mr. Darling rushed into the room moments later, alerted by his wife's cries. His relief was palpable as he hugged his children, tears streaming down his face. "You're home," he murmured. "You're finally home." Wendy turned back to the window, her gaze searching for Peter. He hovered outside, a faint smile on his face. She opened the window wider and leaned out. "Aren't you coming in?" she asked. Peter shook his head. "This is where I belong," he said, gesturing to the night sky. "But I'll visit. You'll see me again, Wendy." Tears filled her eyes, but she smiled. "Goodbye, Peter Pan," she said softly. "Thank you for everything." Peter gave her a playful salute before flying off into the night, Tinker Bell's light trailing behind him like a shooting star. Wendy watched until he disappeared from sight, her heart both heavy and full. Life in London slowly returned to normal, but the Darlings were forever changed. Wendy often sat by the window at night, gazing at the stars and thinking of Neverland. John and Michael regaled their parents with tales of their adventures, their eyes sparkling with the memory of their time with Peter Pan. Though they grew older, the Darling children never forgot the boy who had shown them the magic of flying, the thrill of adventure, and the power of believing in the impossible. And sometimes, on quiet nights, they swore they could hear the faint sound of laughter and the tinkling of bells, as if Peter and Tinker Bell were still watching over them from afar. The stars over London shimmered with a timeless brilliance, as if bearing witness to the extraordinary journey the Darling children had just completed. Back in their cozy nursery, safe and surrounded by the warmth of family, Wendy, John, and Michael found themselves reflecting on their time in Neverland. It felt both like a dream and a memory etched deeply into their hearts, a part of their lives they could never forget. Mrs. Darling, seated once again in her favorite chair by the window, couldn't help but glance toward the stars with gratitude. "You must tell us everything," she said, her voice a mixture of wonder and relief. "Every single detail." Wendy smiled, her eyes twinkling with the same light as the stars above. "We'll tell you," she promised, "but it might take a while. There's so much to share." John and Michael chimed in eagerly, recounting their favorite adventures. John described the daring sword fights with pirates, his logical mind marveling at the strategies he had employed. Michael, with his teddy bear tucked under his arm, recounted the mermaids, the lost boys, and the magical pixie dust that had let them soar through the skies. Their parents listened intently, hanging on every word, their expressions shifting between amazement and amusement. As the children's stories unfolded, Wendy found herself gazing out the window. Her thoughts drifted back to Peter Pan, the boy who refused to grow up, and the magical world he had shown them. She wondered if Peter was watching them now, perhaps from a cloud or a tree in Neverland, a wistful smile on his face. Time, as it often does, began to move forward. The seasons changed, and the darling children grew older. John excelled in his studies, his adventurous spirit tempered by a burgeoning sense of responsibility. Michael, still young, held on to his childlike wonder a little longer, often reenacting battles with imaginary pirates in the garden. Wendy, however, found herself torn between the world of childhood and the inevitable pull of growing up. Her nights by the window became less frequent, though she always left it slightly ajar, just in case. One evening, as she sat at her desk writing, a faint sound caught her attention. It was the soft tinkling of bells, barely audible but unmistakable. Wendy's heart leapt as she rushed to the window, her eyes scanning the sky. For a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of light darting among the stars, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. She smiled, her heart swelling with a bittersweet joy. Peter hadn't forgotten them, just as she had promised never to forget him. Even if he never returned, Wendy knew he was out there, living his endless adventures in the land where time stood still. Years later, Wendy's life had changed in ways she could never have imagined during her time in Neverland. She had grown into a young woman, her days filled with new responsibilities and joys. But even as she embraced the life ahead of her, she held on to the magic of her childhood. She often told her own children stories of Peter Pan, of the boy who could fly, the fierce Captain Hook, and the enchanting world of Neverland. Her children listened with wide eyes, much like John and Michael had once listened to her. "Is Peter Pan real?" her youngest daughter asked one night, her voice filled with wonder. Wendy's smile was tinged with nostalgia. "As real as the stars in the sky," she said softly. "And if you ever hear laughter on the wind, or see a flash of light that disappears too quickly, you'll know he's near." Far away in Neverland, time remained as still as ever. The lost boys continued their mischief. Mermaids sang their haunting songs in the lagoon, and the crocodiles' ticking echoed faintly through the jungle. Peter Pan, unchanged and unchanging, soared through the skies with Tinker Bell at his side. He laughed as he flew, the weight of the world never touching his heart. But every now and then he would pause on a cloud or perch in a tree, gazing at the second star to the right and remembering the girl who had told such wonderful stories. "Do you think she'll ever come back?" Tinker Bell asked one evening, her light dimming slightly as she rested on Peter's shoulder. Peter grinned, though there was a wistfulness in his eyes. "Maybe, or maybe I'll visit her. Who knows?" He shrugged, his carefree nature returning as he leapt into the air. "Come on, Tink. There's a pirate ship out there just waiting to be raided." And with that, he was off, his laughter ringing through the night like a song. Neverland remained unchanged, a sanctuary for eternal childhood and endless adventure, where Peter Pan would always be the boy who never grew up. The darling family's lives continued, full of the joys and challenges that come with growing older. But the memory of Neverland remained a constant presence, a reminder of the magic that exists just beyond the edge of ordinary life. Wendy, John, and Michael carried it with them in different ways, passing it down through stories, laughter, and the belief in the impossible. And so, while the darling children may have left Neverland, a part of them would always remain there among the stars, where dreams and adventures never truly end. The moors stretched vast and untamed, cloaked in a melancholy that clung to the air like a mournful song. Here, the wind seemed to whisper secrets of long-forgotten loves, of heartbreak etched into the very stones. The land was a tapestry of wild beauty, its heather and bracken rolling like waves beneath a restless sky. It was in this desolate paradise that I, Lockwood, found myself, seeking solitude and an escape from the trivialities of city life. Little did I know that the wind-swept hills and shadowy crags of Yorkshire would cradle a tale so fierce and tragic that it would haunt me long after I departed. My destination was Thrushcross Grange, a stately manor nestled in the embrace of the moors, far removed from the clamor of the world. Its sturdy stone walls and serene gardens promised peace, but as I rode through the moorland, my gaze was irresistibly drawn to a darker silhouette in the distance. Wuthering Heights. Even from afar, the house seemed to brood beneath the iron-gray sky, its jagged chimneys piercing the heavens like jaguar teeth. There was a raw, defiant energy about it, as if the very winds that battered its walls were its kin. It called to me, though I could not fathom why. My first visit to Wuthering Heights was unplanned, an impulsive journey born of idle curiosity. As I approached, the air seemed heavier, the silence deeper. The house loomed before me, a fortress of stone that seemed carved from the moor itself, its windows like watchful eyes. The gate resisted my attempts to enter, groaning in protest, and when I finally stepped into the courtyard, I felt as though I had crossed a threshold into another world, a world untamed, where passion and fury reigned supreme. The inhabitants of Wuthering Heights were as enigmatic as the house itself. Heathcliff, the master of this bleak domain, was a man of storm and shadow. His piercing gaze seemed to measure my very soul, and though his manner was brusque, there was an intensity about him that was magnetic, almost otherworldly. His very presence seemed to echo the wildness of the moors, as if he were born of their tempestuous spirit. Then there was the young woman, Catherine Linton, whose beauty was as striking as her melancholy. Her eyes were mirrors of longing, pools of sorrow that hinted at a story too vast for words. The air between her and Heathcliff crackled with an unspoken tension, as if the very walls bore witness to a love so consuming that it had left them both in ruins. My second visit to Wuthering Heights was even stranger, a descent into a realm where dreams and reality blurred. I was given a room to rest, but the night offered no peace. It was there, in the shadows of that ancient house, that I encountered the unearthly presence of Catherine Earnshaw. Her voice, faint and desperate, called to me from the window, pleading to be let in. I awoke trembling, my heart pounding with the certainty that Wuthering Heights was more than a mere house. It was a place where the past clung to the present, where love and revenge were etched into the very stones. As I returned to Thrushcross Grange, shaken and perplexed, the housekeeper, Nellie Dean, offered to unravel the mystery for me. Her voice, warm and steady, promised a tale that would carry me through time, through storms of passion and seas of sorrow, to the very heart of Wuthering Heights. And so, with the moors whispering outside and the fire crackling within, I settled into my chair, ready to hear the story that had been written in blood and tears upon this wild and untamed land. It was not long before I found myself drawn back to Wuthering Heights, compelled by a force I could not name. The winds howled as I made my way across the moors, their mournful cry urging me forward and warning me all at once. The path seemed more treacherous this time, the landscape more brooding. Yet there was a strange allure in the desolation, a siren song that promised secrets and stories untold. As I approached the house, its grim visage loomed larger, the very stones exuding a defiant, almost hostile air. The gate creaked open reluctantly, as though resenting my intrusion. Once inside, I was greeted with the same dour reception as before. The household seemed to exist in a perpetual state of simmering tension, each member an island of misery, isolated and impenetrable. Heathcliff greeted me with his characteristic brusqueness, his dark eyes piercing through me as though he sought to divine my purpose in returning. Hareton Earnshaw, surly and unkempt, lingered nearby, his presence a brooding shadow. And young Catherine Linton, the very picture of fragile defiance, sat apart, her gaze flickering like a trapped flame. Each of them seemed to carry the weight of an unseen burden, their lives tethered to some haunting past. After a stilted exchange, I was once again offered reluctant hospitality. The room assigned to me felt cold and unwelcoming, its walls seeming to close in as the storm outside gained strength. The wind clawed at the windows like a living thing, and the flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows that danced across the ancient furniture. It was then, as I settled in for the night, that my gaze fell upon a small, time-worn book resting on a table by the bedside. The cover was cracked and faded, its leather binding worn smooth by years of use. Intrigued, I opened it, only to discover that it was not a book at all, but a journal. The pages were filled with a delicate, looping script, the ink faded but still legible. It was a girl's hand, and, as I began to read, the words seemed to leap off the page, pulling me into a world both strange and familiar. The entries belonged to Catherine Earnshaw, whose name appeared frequently in the pages, scrawled with a youthful exuberance that belied the sorrow I had sensed in the house. The journal spoke of carefree days on the moors, of laughter carried on the wind and adventures shared with a boy named Heathcliff. There was an innocence to her words, a joy untainted by the shadows that now seemed to envelop Wuthering Heights. But as I read on, the tone shifted. The pages began to speak of secrets and betrayals, of emotions too fierce to be contained. Catherine wrote of her love for Heathcliff with a passion that bordered on madness, a love so consuming that it seemed to define her very being. Yet, intertwined with this devotion was a growing conflict, a sense of duty and ambition that pulled her toward another path. Her words were filled with anguish as she confessed her intention to marry Edgar Linton, a man she described as kind and refined, but lacking the wild, untamed spirit that bound her to Heathcliff. "It would degrade me to marry Heathcliff now," she wrote in one poignant entry. "So he shall never know how much I love him. And that, not because he's handsome, Nellie, but because he's more myself than I am. Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same." The depth of her torment was palpable, each line brimming with emotion so raw and vivid that it seemed to echo in the very walls around me. I could almost hear her voice, young and full of life, pouring out her heart onto the page. Her words painted a picture of a love so fierce and boundless that it defied reason, yet was ultimately caged by the constraints of society and expectation. As I read, a sudden gust of wind rattled the window pane, breaking the spell. The storm outside seemed to mirror the tempest within those pages, a cacophony of rage and longing that refused to be silenced. I set the journal down, my heart heavy with the weight of Catherine's story. Her words lingered in the air, as though the room itself had absorbed her anguish. It was then that I noticed something strange. The candlelight flickered unnaturally, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and shift. A chill ran down my spine as a faint sound reached my ears. A whisper, barely audible, yet unmistakable. It was a voice, distant and desperate, calling out a single name. Heathcliff. I turned toward the window, my pulse quickening. The glass was fogged with condensation, but through the haze I could make out the faint outline of a figure, a pale, spectral presence with eyes that seemed to burn with sorrow. My breath caught as the figure pressed a ghostly hand against the pane, its lips forming silent words. The room seemed to close in around me, the air heavy with an unearthly energy. Panicked, I stumbled backward, clutching the journal as though it were a talisman. The figure faded into the storm, leaving behind only the echo of its cry. My heart pounded as I sank onto the bed, the journal clutched tightly in my hands. Catherine's words, her love, her torment, they were no longer confined to the pages. They lived in the very fabric of Wuthering Heights, a haunting legacy that refused to be forgotten. When morning came, I fled the house, the journal weighing heavy in my pocket. The storm had passed, but its echoes lingered in my mind. As I returned to Thrushcross Grange, I resolved to learn the full story behind the ghostly presence that had visited me, and the tragic tale etched into Catherine's words. And so, when Nellie Dean offered to recount the history of Wuthering Heights, I accepted without hesitation, eager to unravel the mystery that had ensnared me. The moors seemed to sigh as I listened, their wild beauty a fitting backdrop for a story of love and vengeance that would forever haunt my soul. The story of Heathcliff and Catherine began in the heart of Wuthering Heights, a house both refuge and battleground, where love and cruelty coexisted in a turbulent dance. It was there, amidst the wild Yorkshire moors, that their lives became inextricably entwined. To understand the depth of their bond, one must return to their childhood, where the seeds of their fateful connection were first sown. It was a stormy evening when Mr. Earnshaw, the stern yet kind-hearted master of Wuthering Heights, returned from a trip to Liverpool with an unexpected burden cradled in his arms. Beneath his coat was a child, dark-haired and sullen-eyed, with a face that seemed to hold the weight of worlds despite his tender age. Heathcliff, as the boy came to be known, was a foundling, picked up from the streets and brought home to live among the Earnshaws. His origins were a mystery, his name a relic of some forgotten place, but from the moment he crossed the threshold, he altered the course of every life within those walls. The boy's arrival was met with mixed reactions. Hindley, Mr. Earnshaw's son, regarded Heathcliff as an intruder, a rival for his father's affection. His resentment burned hot and immediate, manifesting in taunts and cruelties that would only deepen with time. But Catherine, the fiery, untamed daughter of the house, saw something in Heathcliff that others overlooked. Perhaps it was his defiance, the spark in his dark eyes that refused to be extinguished despite the hardships he endured. Or perhaps it was simply that she, too, was a creature of the wild, drawn to kindred spirits like moth to flame. From the moment they met, Catherine and Heathcliff were inseparable. Together they roamed the moors, their laughter carried on the wind like a melody only they could hear. They were children of the earth and sky, running barefoot through the heather, climbing rocks and chasing the clouds. The moors became their sanctuary, a boundless expanse where they could escape the confines of Wuthering Heights and the harsh realities that awaited them there. Their bond was forged in shared mischief and rebellion. They were often scolded for their wildness, for returning home with mud-streaked faces and torn clothes, but no reprimand could quell their spirits. Catherine, with her sharp wit and boundless energy, was the ringleader of their adventures, while Heathcliff, quieter but no less daring, followed her lead with unwavering loyalty. Together, they were an unstoppable force, a tempest that no one could tame. Yet, beneath the surface of their carefree camaraderie, a deeper connection was forming. Heathcliff, who had known nothing but hardship and rejection before arriving at Wuthering Heights, found in Catherine a source of light and warmth. She was the first person to truly see him, to look beyond his rough exterior and recognize the fierce, yearning soul beneath. For Catherine, Heathcliff was a reflection of her own wildness, a mirror that showed her who she was when freed from the constraints of propriety and expectation. But their idyllic days were shadowed by Hindley's growing animosity. When Mr. Earnshaw passed away, Hindley assumed control of Wuthering Heights, and with it, the power to make Heathcliff's life a living hell. Stripped of his status as an adopted son, Heathcliff was reduced to the role of a servant, forced to endure endless humiliation and hard labor. Yet, even as Hindley sought to crush him, Heathcliff's spirit remained unbroken, sustained by his bond with Catherine. Catherine, too, felt the weight of Hindley's cruelty, though in a different way. As the young mistress of Wuthering Heights, she was expected to conform to a certain standard of behavior, to shed her wild ways and become a proper lady. But Catherine was not so easily tamed. She continued to defy convention, sneaking away to the moors with Heathcliff whenever she could, their shared rebellion a balm for the wounds inflicted by life within the house. Their bond grew stronger with each passing year, but it was also becoming more complicated. What had begun as a childhood friendship was evolving into something deeper, something neither of them fully understood. There were moments when their laughter would falter, replaced by a tension that neither could articulate. In those moments, their gazes would meet, and the unspoken connection between them would pulse like a living thing, raw and undeniable. It was during one of their adventures that they first encountered Thrushcross Grange, the neighboring estate that stood in stark contrast to Wuthering Heights. While Wuthering Heights was rugged and wind-beaten, Thrushcross Grange was a picture of refinement, with its manicured gardens and grand facade. Drawn by curiosity, Catherine and Heathcliff crept close to the house, peering through the windows like mischievous spirits. Inside, they saw Edgar and Isabella Linton, children of privilege, surrounded by luxury and ease. Catherine, ever the instigator, teased Heathcliff about the Lintons' polished manners and fine clothes, her laughter ringing out like a challenge to the world. But their light-hearted game took a dark turn when they were discovered, and Catherine was injured in the ensuing commotion. Taken in by the Lintons to recover, she found herself thrust into a world unlike anything she had known, a world of silken cushions and soft-spoken civility. During her stay at Thrushcross Grange, Catherine was transformed. When she returned to Wuthering Heights weeks later, she was almost unrecognizable. Her rough edges had been smoothed away, her wildness tempered by the influence of the Lintons. She wore fine dresses and carried herself with a newfound grace, but beneath the surface, she was still the same Catherine, still tethered to the moors and to Heathcliff. Heathcliff, however, saw only the change. He felt the distance that had grown between them, the unbridgeable gap created by their differing stations in life. For the first time, he began to fear that he might lose her, that the world beyond the moors might claim her as its own. His jealousy burned hot and bitter, fueling a resentment that would only grow with time. Yet, despite the changes and challenges, their bond endured. Catherine and Heathcliff remained two halves of the same whole, their souls intertwined in a way that defied logic and reason. They were the storm and the fire, the wildness of the moors made flesh. And though the shadows of the past and the pressures of the present threatened to pull them apart, they clung to each other with a desperation born of love and need. Their early years were a prelude to the tragedy that would follow, a foundation built on love, defiance, and an unyielding connection to the moors. They were children of the wild, bound by a force greater than themselves, destined to leave an indelible mark on the land and on each other. And, as their story unfolded, the winds of Wuthering Heights carried their laughter, their tears, and their passions across the moors, weaving them into the very fabric of the place they called home. The transformation began on a night drenched in chaos, when Catherine Earnshaw and Heathcliff, in their youthful mischief, ventured too close to Thrushcross Grange. The neighboring estate stood in regal contrast to Wuthering Heights, its polished facade a world away from the weather-worn stone and windswept wildness of their home. It was a place they viewed with equal parts disdain and curiosity, for what could that gilded cage offer compared to the untamed freedom of the moors? It had been Catherine's idea to approach the Grange, her restless energy as irrepressible as the storm winds that often swept across the hills. Heathcliff followed her lead, as he always did, their bond so unshakable that he would have followed her into the depths of hell itself. Together, they crept toward the grand house, their laughter low and conspiratorial as they pressed their faces to the windows, eager to glimpse the lives of the Lintons. What they saw inside was a tableau of luxury and refinement. Edgar and Isabella Linton, with their golden hair and delicate features, sat beside a roaring fire, surrounded by rich furnishings and golden light. The siblings bickered over a dog, their voices soft and measured even in disagreement. To Catherine and Heathcliff, the scene was both fascinating and absurd, the trivialities of the Lintons' lives a far cry from the raw, untamed existence they shared. But their laughter drew attention, and in the ensuing commotion, Catherine stumbled and fell, her ankle twisting beneath her. The Lintons' servants rushed out to investigate, and in the confusion, Catherine was carried inside, leaving Heathcliff to retreat into the shadows. His heart burned with anger and jealousy as he watched her disappear into the house, a wild creature plucked from her natural habitat and thrust into a world that seemed poised to devour her. Catherine's injury, though minor, became the catalyst for her prolonged stay at Thrushcross Grange. Over the weeks that followed, she was enveloped in the Lintons' world, a place of silken curtains, polished mirrors, and soft-spoken decorum. The experience was transformative, reshaping Catherine in ways that would leave her forever changed. At first, she chafed against the constraints of her new environment. She missed the wind on her face, the feel of the earth beneath her feet, and the freedom of the moors. The Lintons' house, for all its beauty, felt like a gilded cage, its air thick with the scent of roses and propriety. But as the days turned to weeks, Catherine began to adapt. Her sharp edges softened under the influence of Isabella's gentle manners and Edgar's quiet charm. She learned to sit still, to speak with measured words, and to move with a grace that had previously been foreign to her. Edgar Linton, in particular, became a significant figure in Catherine's transformation. With his golden hair and calm demeanor, he was everything Heathcliff was not. Steady, refined, and entirely unthreatening. Edgar admired Catherine with a quiet intensity, his affections expressed not through fiery passion but through gentle attentions. He brought her books and flowers, his gifts an attempt to draw her further into his world. And though Catherine missed Heathcliff with a longing that cut deep, she found herself intrigued by Edgar's quiet devotion. When Catherine finally returned to Wuthering Heights, the change in her was undeniable. She stepped into the house like a vision, her dress finer than anything the household had ever seen, her manner imbued with an air of sophistication that seemed almost foreign. Heathcliff, who had waited for her with a yearning that bordered on agony, could only stare in stunned silence. The girl who stood before him was still Catherine, but she was also someone else entirely, a stranger shaped by forces he could neither understand nor control. Catherine, too, felt the chasm that had opened between them. She greeted Heathcliff with the same affection as before, but his surly demeanor and rough appearance now seemed at odds with the polished world she had come to know. She teased him about his unkempt hair and muddy clothes, her laughter tinged with a new condescension that cut him like a knife. Yet beneath her words was a desperation to bridge the gap between them, to hold on to the connection that had always defined them. Heathcliff, however, could not hide his pain. He saw in Catherine's transformation a threat to everything they had shared, a force that could pull her away from him and into the arms of Edgar Linton. His jealousy was a tempest, wild and consuming, and though he tried to mask it with his usual stoicism, it seeped into his every word and gesture. Catherine's time at Thrushcross Grange had not only altered her outward appearance, but also ignited an internal conflict that would come to define her. She loved Heathcliff with a passion that defied reason, a love that was as much a part of her as the blood in her veins. Yet, she also saw in Edgar a future that was safe, stable, and socially acceptable. The two men represented opposing forces in her life. One the wild, untamed spirit of the moors, the other the polished elegance of the Grange. This duality tore at Catherine's soul, her love for Heathcliff clashing with her desire for the comforts and status Edgar could provide. She confided her turmoil to Nellie Dean, her trusted confidant, in moments of raw vulnerability. "I am Heathcliff," she once declared, her voice trembling with the weight of her emotions. "Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same." Yet, even as she spoke these words, she admitted her intention to marry Edgar, a decision born not of love, but of ambition and practicality. Catherine's transformation was, in many ways, a reflection of the larger forces at play in her life. She was caught between two worlds, two men, and two versions of herself. On one side was the wild, free-spirited girl who roamed the moors with Heathcliff, her laughter echoing in the wind. On the other was the refined young woman who had learned to navigate the social graces of the Lintons' world, her every step a calculated dance. This conflict would come to define not only Catherine's life, but also the lives of everyone around her. Her transformation at Thrushcross Grange was the beginning of a series of choices and consequences that would ripple through generations, shaping the fates of those who called Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange home. It was a moment of change, a turning point that marked the end of innocence and the beginning of a tragedy that would echo across the moors like a mournful cry. As the days passed and Catherine settled back into life at Wuthering Heights, the tensions between her and Heathcliff grew more pronounced. Their love, once so pure and unshakable, was now shadowed by doubt, jealousy, and the weight of unspoken truths. And yet, even as the cracks began to form, the bond between them remained unbreakable, a force as wild and enduring as the moors themselves. It was a love that defied reason, a love that would endure even in the face of betrayal, heartbreak, and death. The air at Wuthering Heights seemed heavier after Catherine's return from Thrushcross Grange, as if the house itself sensed the shift in her heart. Heathcliff felt it most keenly. Though Catherine remained his constant companion, her transformation had created a distance between them, a distance she refused to acknowledge, and he could not bear. It was as if the moors, once a vast and endless realm of freedom, had become a chasm they could no longer cross together. Catherine's days were now divided between the rugged chaos of Wuthering Heights and the polished serenity of Thrushcross Grange. Her visits to the Lintons grew more frequent, and with them, her attachment to Edgar Linton deepened. Edgar, with his gentle manners and adoring gaze, represented a life of stability and refinement, a world far removed from the tempestuous existence she shared with Heathcliff. And yet, beneath her newfound grace and elegance, Catherine's heart still beat with the wildness of the moors, a wildness that bound her irrevocably to Heathcliff. Heathcliff, however, could only see what was slipping away. He watched in agony as Catherine moved further into Edgar's world, her laughter softer, her words more measured. He felt the sting of her playful barbs, her teasing remarks about his roughness and lack of polish. Each word was a knife, cutting away at the fierce loyalty he had always felt from her. He began to retreat into himself, his silences growing longer, his gaze darker. His love for Catherine remained as fierce as ever, but it was now shadowed by doubt and fear. A fear that he would lose her to the very world she had once scorned. The turning point came on a fateful evening, when Catherine confided in Nellie Dean, the housekeeper and reluctant witness to their unfolding tragedy. Catherine had been agitated all day, pacing the rooms of Wuthering Heights like a caged animal, her thoughts a storm she could not contain. Finally, she sought out Nellie, her trusted confidant, and poured out her heart in a torrent of words. "I love Heathcliff," she began, her voice trembling with the force of her emotions. "He's more myself than I am. Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same. If all else perished, and he remained, I should still continue to be. And if all else remained, and he were annihilated, the universe would turn to a mighty stranger." Her words, so raw and passionate, seemed to fill the room with their weight. But even as she spoke them, a shadow crossed her face. She hesitated, her gaze distant, as if she were looking into a future she could not bear to imagine. "And yet," she continued, her voice softer now, "it would degrade me to marry Heathcliff. He has no money, no position. If I married him, we would be beggars, living in the dust. I must marry Edgar. He is handsome and rich, and will make me the greatest lady in the neighborhood. It's not that I love Edgar in the same way, but Heathcliff and I, we are one. He does not need to hear my words to know my heart." Catherine's confession, so conflicted and contradictory, revealed the depths of her internal struggle. She loved Heathcliff with every fiber of her being, but she was also drawn to the security and status Edgar could provide. It was a betrayal not born of malice, but of fear. A fear of the hardships she believed she could not endure, even for the sake of love. What Catherine did not realize was that Heathcliff had overheard her words. He had come to find her, drawn by an intuition he could not explain, and had paused outside the door just as she began her confession. Her declaration of love for him filled him with a fierce, fleeting joy, but it was swiftly eclipsed by the pain of her next words. The idea that she would marry another man, not for love, but for status, was a blow that shattered something deep within him. Heathcliff left the house before Catherine could finish speaking, his footsteps heavy with despair. He walked out into the night, the moors stretching before him like an endless void. The wind howled around him, a reflection of the storm within, but for the first time, the wildness of the moors brought him no solace. He felt untethered, a ship cast adrift without anchor or compass. The one person who had always been his North Star had turned away, and he could see no path forward. When Catherine discovered his absence, she was inconsolable. She searched for him throughout the house, calling his name into the wind, but there was no answer. Days passed, then weeks, and still there was no sign of Heathcliff. Catherine's anguish grew with each passing moment, her vibrant spirit dimmed by the weight of her guilt and sorrow. She had not meant to drive him away. She had spoken those words out of fear, not rejection. But Heathcliff was gone, and with him, a piece of her soul. At Thrushcross Grange, Edgar sought to comfort her, unaware of the true depth of her despair. He mistook her melancholy for a natural reluctance to leave her childhood home, and did his best to make her happy. Catherine, for her part, threw herself into the preparations for their wedding with a desperate energy, as if by embracing her new life, she could bury the pain of losing Heathcliff. But her laughter was hollow, her smiles fleeting, and the moors, once her sanctuary, now seemed to mourn alongside her. As the days turned to months, the memory of Heathcliff lingered like a shadow over Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange. Catherine's love for him had not diminished, but she had chosen a path that led away from him, a path she could not abandon without losing the fragile stability she had sought in Edgar. And so, she carried on, a woman divided, her heart forever torn between the wild, untamed passion of the past and the quiet, measured security of the present. Heathcliff's departure was not the end of their story, but the beginning of its darkest chapter. His absence left a void that could not be filled, a wound that festered in the hearts of those who loved him. And though Catherine tried to move forward, the echoes of her betrayal and Heathcliff's pain would haunt her for the rest of her days, a reminder of the love that had once burned so brightly, only to be consumed by the choices they had made. Years passed, and the moors seemed to shift with the seasons, though the pain of Heathcliff's departure remained a constant shadow over Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange. Catherine had settled into her role as Edgar Linton's wife, her once fiery spirit tempered by the demands of her new life. The Grange, with its pristine gardens and genteel air, became her sanctuary, a place where she could bury her regrets beneath the veneer of propriety. Yet, the wildness in her heart, the part of her bound to the moors and to Heathcliff, never truly faded. It lingered like a distant storm, always on the horizon. Then, one fateful day, Heathcliff returned. His arrival was as sudden and startling as a thunderclap. The household at Wuthering Heights was abuzz with rumors of a dark figure striding up the path, a man transformed yet unmistakable. Heathcliff, who had once been a penniless outcast, now carried himself with the air of someone who had conquered the world. His clothes were fine, his demeanor commanding, and his pockets, it seemed, were lined with wealth. The boy, who had left Wuthering Heights in despair, had returned a man of power and mystery. His reappearance sent ripples through both households, unsettling the fragile balance that had been established in his absence. At Wuthering Heights, Hindley Earnshaw, now a broken man consumed by his vices, greeted Heathcliff with a mix of suspicion and reluctant hospitality. Heathcliff, ever calculating, saw an opportunity in Hindley's weakness. It did not take long for him to insinuate himself back into the household, his presence both a reminder of the past and a harbinger of what was to come. At Thrushcross Grange, Catherine was struck dumb by the news of Heathcliff's return. When he finally appeared before her, it was as though the years had melted away, leaving them as they had been. Two souls bound together by a love that defied reason. Yet, there was something different about Heathcliff now, a hardness in his eyes that spoke of the wounds he had carried and the plans he had forged in the dark. Their reunion was electric, charged with the tension of unspoken words and unresolved emotions. Catherine's joy at seeing him again was tempered by the knowledge of all that had transpired in his absence. She was a married woman now, her life tied to Edgar's gentle love and the comforts of Thrushcross Grange. Yet, the sight of Heathcliff stirred something deep within her, a longing she had tried to bury but could never forget. For his part, Heathcliff was a man torn between love and vengeance. The sight of Catherine, as beautiful and untamed as he remembered, reignited the fire that had never truly extinguished in his heart. But alongside that love was a bitterness that had festered during his years away, a need to avenge the wrongs he had suffered and reclaim what had been taken from him. His revenge began quietly, almost imperceptibly, as he set his sights on Hindley. Heathcliff exploited Hindley's gambling habit, lending him money with the full knowledge that he would never be able to repay it. Over time, Heathcliff gained control of Wuthering Heights, the house that had once been his prison and now became his stronghold. He transformed it into a place of power and menace, its walls echoing with the dark satisfaction of his triumph. But Heathcliff's plans extended beyond Hindley. His gaze turned toward Thrushcross Grange, where Edgar Linton lived in blissful ignorance of the storm gathering on the horizon. Heathcliff began to court Isabella Linton, Edgar's younger sister, with a charm that masked his true intentions. Isabella, naive and sheltered, was captivated by Heathcliff's dark allure, mistaking his intensity for passion. She fell for him with a reckless abandon, blind to the cruelty that lurked beneath his surface. Catherine, meanwhile, watched the unfolding drama with growing unease. She saw through Heathcliff's calculated charm and recognized the danger in his actions. Yet, she could not deny the pull he still had over her. Their encounters were charged with emotion, their words cutting and passionate in equal measure. Heathcliff accused her of betraying him, of choosing comfort over love, while Catherine lashed out in defense of the choices she had made. Their love, once so pure and boundless, had become a battlefield, each of them wounded and lashing out in turn. Heathcliff's marriage to Isabella was the culmination of his revenge against Edgar. It was not an act of love, but of spite, a means to hurt the man who had taken Catherine from him. Isabella, once so enamored of Heathcliff, quickly realized the truth of his nature. Her life at Wuthering Heights became a living nightmare, her every day filled with cruelty and despair. Heathcliff's treatment of her was a reflection of his inner torment, his love for Catherine twisted into a weapon against those around him. Catherine's health began to decline under the weight of the conflict. torn between her loyalty to Edgar and her enduring love for Heathcliff, she found herself caught in a storm of her own making. Her fiery spirit, once her greatest strength, now consumed her, leaving her fragile and unwell. The strain of their love and its consequences was too much for her to bear, and she withdrew into herself, her once vibrant energy fading like the last rays of sunlight over the moors. Heathcliff, for all his bitterness and rage, could not ignore Catherine's suffering. His visits to Thrushcross Grange became more frequent, their encounters a tumult of love and fury. They spoke of the past, of what might have been, and of the love that still burned between them despite everything. In those moments, the walls they had built between themselves seemed to crumble, leaving only the raw, unfiltered connection that had always defined them. But their reconciliation was not enough to halt the trajectory of their tragedy. Heathcliff's revenge had set events in motion that could not be undone. Hindley's ruin, Isabella's suffering, and Catherine's decline were all part of the tapestry he had woven. A tapestry of pain and retribution that mirrored the turmoil within him. Heathcliff's return to Wuthering Heights had been a thunderous re-entry into the lives of those who had wronged him. Yet, his vengeance, though meticulously planned and ruthlessly executed, brought him no peace. The love he bore for Catherine, the driving force behind all he did, remained both his greatest strength and his greatest torment. And, as the shadows deepened over the moors, it became clear that his story, like Catherine's, was one of passion and destruction, bound together inextricably until the very end. Catherine's decline began as a whisper, a subtle erosion of the fiery spirit that had once defined her. To those who knew her, it was as if the light within her had begun to flicker, dimmed by the storm of emotions that swirled around her. The woman who had once roamed the moors with wild abandon, who had laughed into the wind and claimed the world as her own, was now a shadow of herself, her vibrant energy slowly giving way to fragility. It was the weight of the love triangle that bore down on her, a love too vast to be contained and too fierce to find peace. Caught between her loyalty to Edgar, her husband, and her unyielding connection to Heathcliff, her soul seemed torn asunder. Each day, the chasm between the two men widened, and Catherine, standing on its edge, felt herself slipping into the abyss. Her health began to falter, though it was her spirit that seemed most afflicted. She withdrew from the household at Thrushcross Grange, her laughter fading into silence. Edgar, ever devoted, was blind to the true cause of her suffering. He attributed her malaise to the strain of her delicate constitution, unaware that the root of her anguish lay in her unspoken longing for Heathcliff. Catherine, for all her stubbornness, could not bring herself to confide in Edgar. To do so would have been to shatter the fragile peace they had built. It was Heathcliff's re-entry into her life that had ignited this slow descent. His presence was both a balm and a poison, awakening feelings she had tried to bury, and reigniting the turmoil that had always burned between them. Their encounters, fraught with passion and bitterness, left her drained yet unable to let him go. Each meeting was a storm, their words cutting as deeply as their gazes. Heathcliff accused her of betrayal, of choosing comfort over love, while Catherine lashed out with equal fury, her anger masking the pain that lay beneath. One evening, after a particularly heated argument with Heathcliff, Catherine retreated to her room and refused to emerge. She paced like a caged animal, her thoughts racing and her emotions consuming her. The walls seemed to close in, and the air grew heavy, as if the house itself were mourning alongside her. When Nellie came to check on her, she found Catherine feverish and agitated, her eyes bright with a manic energy. "I am dying, Nellie," Catherine declared, her voice trembling with a mix of despair and defiance. "And they shall both be sorry, Edgar for breaking my heart, and Heathcliff for tearing it in two." Nellie, though accustomed to Catherine's dramatic tendencies, felt a pang of fear at the intensity of her words. She tried to soothe her, to convince her that she was merely unwell and would recover with rest, but Catherine would not be comforted. Her mind was consumed by visions of the past, of the moors, and the laughter she had shared with Heathcliff, of the days before her world had fractured. The days that followed saw Catherine confined to her bed, her condition deteriorating rapidly. Edgar, though distraught, did his best to care for her, his love evident in every gentle touch and whispered word. He brought her flowers from the garden, read to her from her favorite books, and sat by her side for hours on end. But Catherine's gaze often drifted past him, her thoughts far away, her heart drawn to the wild expanse of the moors and the man who had come to define her existence. Heathcliff, though forbidden from visiting her openly, could not stay away. He prowled the edges of Thrushcross Grange like a restless spirit, desperate for news of her condition. When he finally learned of her worsening state, he could bear it no longer. One night, as the household slept, he made his way to her room, his footsteps silent, and his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and longing. When he entered, Catherine was sitting by the window, her frail form silhouetted against the pale moonlight. She turned at the sound of his approach, and for a moment the years melted away. They were no longer the people they had become, weighed down by the choices and betrayals that had defined their lives. In that moment, they were simply Catherine and Heathcliff, two souls bound together by a love that had transcended time and reason. "You have come," Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew you would." Heathcliff crossed the room in a few strides, his dark eyes fixed on her as if trying to memorize every detail. "How could I not?" he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You are my life, Catherine. Without you, there is nothing." Their conversation was raw, unfiltered, each word a declaration of the love and anguish that had consumed them. Catherine accused him of cruelty, of pushing her toward Edgar and away from him. Heathcliff countered with accusations of his own, railing against her betrayal and the pain it had caused him. Yet, beneath their anger was a desperate yearning, a need to hold on to each other despite everything that had passed between them. "I cannot rest without you," Catherine said, her eyes shining with tears. "I cannot die without knowing that you will not forget me." "Forget you?" Heathcliff echoed, his voice breaking. "You are in my very soul, Catherine. Wherever I go, whatever I do, I will carry you with me." Their reunion was both a solace and a torment, a fleeting moment of connection that only deepened the tragedy of their circumstances. When Heathcliff finally left her room, his heart was heavier than ever, weighed down by the knowledge that he could not save her. Catherine, too, was left with a profound sense of loss, her love for Heathcliff burning as brightly as ever, but unable to alter the course of her fate. The end came quietly, on a night when the wind howled through the moors like a mournful dirge. Catherine passed away in the early hours of the morning, her final breath a whisper of Heathcliff's name. Edgar, who had been by her side until the very end, was inconsolable, his grief a quiet, dignified thing that belied the depth of his love for her. Heathcliff's reaction, however, was anything but quiet. When he heard the news, he stormed onto the moors, his cries of anguish echoing into the night. He railed against the heavens, cursing the fate that had taken Catherine from him. His grief was a raw, terrible thing, a reflection of the love that had defined and destroyed him. Catherine's death marked the end of an era at Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange, but her presence lingered, a ghostly echo in the lives of those she had left behind. The moors, once her sanctuary, seemed to mourn her passing, their winds whispering her name as they carried her spirit across the hills. And for Heathcliff, her loss was a wound that would never heal, a constant reminder of the love that had shaped his life and bound him to the wild, untamed beauty of the moors forever. The storm that had raged between Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange for so many years finally began to abate, leaving in its wake a desolate calm. The passions that had consumed Heathcliff, Catherine, and those caught in their orbit seemed to settle into the soil of the moors, becoming part of the landscape itself. Yet, amidst the ruins of broken hearts and bitter vengeance, the seeds of redemption quietly took root. At the center of this fragile hope were Hareton Earnshaw and young Catherine Linton, the children of a generation marked by pain. Hareton, the neglected and mistreated son of Hindley, had grown up in the shadow of Heathcliff's cruelty, his natural intelligence stifled by years of degradation. And Catherine, the daughter of Edgar and the late Catherine, bore the legacy of her mother's beauty and willfulness, but carried within her a gentler spirit. Their relationship began as a clash of stubborn wills, but over time it became a story of growth and healing. Hareton, despite the harshness of his upbringing, had a quiet strength that could not be extinguished. Though Heathcliff had denied him the education and privileges that should have been his by birthright, Hareton possessed an innate dignity, a spark of kindness that refused to be smothered. Young Catherine, raised in the comfort of Thrushcross Grange, initially looked down on Hareton, mocking his lack of refinement and treating him with the disdain that her mother might have shown in similar circumstances. But beneath her sharp words was a curiosity about the man who had endured so much, and yet retained his humanity. Their relationship began to change in the aftermath of Heathcliff's decline. The man who had once seemed indomitable now appeared diminished, his once fiery passion consumed by a quiet, haunting despair. His obsession with Catherine Earnshaw, long his driving force, had left him hollow. The house at Wuthering Heights, once vibrant with conflict, grew quieter, its shadows deeper, as Heathcliff withdrew further into himself. His vengeance had run its course, and with Catherine's memory weighing on him, he seemed to lose interest in the world around him. It was in this lull that Hareton and young Catherine found themselves drawn together. Their interactions, once marked by hostility, began to soften. Catherine, seeing the pain Hareton carried, began to feel shame for her previous cruelty. She reached out to him with small gestures of kindness, offering to teach him to read and sharing stories from her books. Hareton, though wary at first, accepted her help, his initial awkwardness giving way to a hunger for knowledge that mirrored his longing for connection. Their moments together became a source of solace for them both. Catherine, who had lived much of her life sheltered from the harsher realities of Wuthering Heights, found in Hareton a sense of strength and resilience that she admired. And Hareton, who had spent so much of his life in the shadows, discovered in Catherine a light that gave him hope for something better. The bond that grew between them was slow and tentative, but it carried a sincerity that stood in stark contrast to the tumultuous relationships of the past. Heathcliff watched their growing closeness with a strange mixture of detachment and melancholy. The fire that had driven him for so long was gone, leaving behind only the ashes of his former self. He no longer found satisfaction in the pain of others, nor did he take pleasure in the power he had wielded over Wuthering Heights. Instead, he seemed consumed by the memory of Catherine Earnshaw, her presence as vivid and tormenting as ever. He wandered the moors in solitude, his steps aimless, his gaze distant, as if searching for something just beyond his reach. One evening, as the wind howled around the house, Heathcliff called Hareton to his side. For the first time, his tone was not one of command, but of quiet resignation. He studied the young man for a long moment, his expression unreadable before speaking. "You remind me of someone," he said at last, his voice low and rough. "Someone I loved and hated in equal measure. Perhaps you can be better than I was." It was an unexpected moment of vulnerability, a glimpse of the man beneath the armor of vengeance. Hareton, though surprised, did not respond with words. Instead, he nodded, the unspoken understanding between them marking the closest thing to peace Heathcliff would ever find. As the days turned to weeks, Heathcliff's decline became more pronounced. He grew thinner, his movements slower, and his gaze more distant. It was as if he were fading, his soul slipping away to join Catherine's on the moors, where they had once roamed together. His death, when it came, was quiet and unremarkable. He was found in Catherine's old room, his face turned toward the window as if seeking the horizon. A faint smile lingered on his lips, as though he had finally found the reunion he had long sought. With Heathcliff's passing, Wuthering Heights was left to Hareton and young Catherine. The house, so long a symbol of strife and sorrow, began to change under their care. Catherine, with her gentle determination, brought light to its shadowed halls, filling the rooms with warmth and laughter. Hareton, once relegated to the role of an outcast, stepped into his birthright with quiet dignity, his strength tempered by the love and support he found in Catherine. Their bond, forged through shared trials and mutual understanding, became a testament to the possibility of redemption. Where the previous generation had been consumed by passion and vengeance, Hareton and Catherine found balance and peace. Their love was not the fiery tempest that had defined Heathcliff and Catherine Earnshaw's relationship, but a steady flame that promised a brighter future. As their wedding day approached, the moors seemed to echo their joy, the wildflowers blooming in abundance, and the wind carrying whispers of hope. The ceremony, held on the grounds of Thrushcross Grange, was a simple affair, attended by those who had witnessed the tragedy of the past and now looked forward to the promise of renewal. Nellie Dean, who had seen it all unfold, shed quiet tears of relief and happiness, her heart lightened by the knowledge that the cycle of pain had finally been broken. In the days that followed, the transformation of Wuthering Heights continued. The house, once a place of darkness, became a home filled with light and laughter. The scars of the past remained, but they no longer defined the lives of those who lived there. Instead, they served as reminders of the strength it took to overcome them. Hareton and Catherine's story was one of resolution and redemption, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Their love, born of hardship and healing, brought new life to the moors and to the houses that had once been steeped in sorrow. And, as they walked hand in hand across the hills, the wind carrying their laughter into the horizon. It was clear that they had found not just happiness, but a peace that would endure for generations to come. The moors, ever constant and eternal, bore witness to it all, their wild beauty a fitting backdrop for a tale of love, loss, and renewal. And though the echoes of the past remained, whispering through the heather and the bracken, they no longer haunted the living. Instead, they became part of the landscape, a reminder that even amidst the darkest storms, there is always the possibility of light. The story of Wuthering Heights lingers like the wind across the moors, ever present, ever haunting. Long after the passions that once raged within its walls have settled into memory, the house remains, a monument to love, vengeance, and the frailty of the human heart. Its stones, worn and weathered, seem to whisper the names of those who lived and loved there, their stories etched into the very fabric of the land. As Lockwood, I was but a passer-by in this tale, an observer drawn into its depths by chance. When I first arrived at Thrushcross Grange, I sought nothing more than solitude, a respite from the clamor of the world. But the moors, with their wild beauty and untamed spirit, held more than mere peace. They held a story, ancient and eternal, of lives intertwined by fate and undone by choice. It was a story I could not resist, even as it unsettled my soul. The lives of Catherine Earnshaw and Heathcliff were the heart of that story, a bond forged in the fires of love and destruction. They were two halves of the same whole, their souls so deeply intertwined that even death could not sever their connection. Their love, fierce and unyielding, defied convention and reason, yet it was also the source of their undoing. They burned too brightly, consumed by the intensity of their feelings, leaving in their wake a trail of devastation that touched everyone around them. And yet, amidst the ruin, there was redemption. Hareton Earnshaw and young Catherine Linton, the heirs of this tragic legacy, emerged from the shadows to reclaim the light. Their love, so different from the tempestuous passion of their predecessors, was a balm to the wounds of the past. It was a love built on understanding, on mutual respect and healing, a love that promised a future unburdened by the sins of those who came before. When I returned to Wuthering Heights one final time, it was as if I were stepping into a different world. The house, once a place of shadows and sorrow, had undergone a transformation. The heavy air that had hung over it for so long had lifted, replaced by a quiet warmth that spoke of new beginnings. The halls, which had once echoed with the cries of anger and grief, now carried the gentle sounds of laughter and life. I found Hareton and Catherine in the garden, their hands intertwined, their faces alight with a joy that seemed to radiate from within. They spoke to me with kindness, their words carrying none of the bitterness or anger that had so long defined the inhabitants of Wuthering Heights. They were building something new, something hopeful, and in their presence, I felt the weight of the past begin to ease. Before I departed, I took one last walk across the moors, the wind tugging at my coat and the heather brushing against my boots. I visited the graves of those whose lives had been so deeply entwined with this land. Catherine Earnshaw, Edgar Linton, and Heathcliff. Their resting places, side by side, seemed to tell their own story, one of love and loss, of choices made and consequences endured. As I stood there, the wind carried with it the faintest echo of laughter, as though the spirits of Catherine and Heathcliff still roamed the moors they had loved so dearly. It was not a sound of sorrow, but of something deeper, something eternal. Their love, for all its pain and imperfection, had left an indelible mark on the world. It had shaped the lives of those who followed, forging a path to redemption that might otherwise have been lost. The moors, with their wild beauty and untamed spirit, remain unchanged by time, a reminder of the eternal nature of the human soul. They are a place of contrasts, both desolate and alive, harsh and forgiving. It is fitting that this land, so raw and untamed, should have borne witness to such a story, for it is a place where the boundaries between life and death, love and hate, seem to blur. As I returned to Thrushcross Grange for the final time, I carried with me a sense of peace I had not known before. The story of Wuthering Heights, for all its tragedy, was also a story of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is a spark of light. It is a story that will live on, carried by the wind across the moors, whispered through the heather, and etched into the hearts of those who hear it. In the end, Wuthering Heights is not merely a house, nor is it merely a tale of love and vengeance. It is a testament to the complexities of the human heart, to the power of love to both create and destroy. It is a story that speaks to the eternal struggle between our wildest passions and our deepest fears. A story that reminds us of the beauty and the pain of being alive. As I closed the door on Thrushcross Grange and began my journey away from the moors, I felt a quiet gratitude for having been a part of this tale, however briefly. The people of Wuthering Heights, Catherine, Heathcliff, Edgar, Hareton, and young Catherine, had left their mark on me, as they had on the land they called home. And though I would leave, their story would remain, woven into the very fabric of the moors, a tale as eternal as the wind that whispers through the heather.